In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte was the ruler of France and much of continental Europe. He had built a powerful army and expanded French influence through a series of wars that had defeated nearly all major European powers. By 1812, Napoleon's empire stretched from Spain in the west to the borders of Russia in the east. His political and military strategies aimed to maintain French dominance across Europe and to isolate Britain economically through a policy known as the Continental System. The Continental System was designed to prevent European nations from trading with Britain. Napoleon believed that if Britain could not trade, it would weaken economically and be forced to surrender to French influence. Russia, under Tsar Alexander I, was formally an ally of France after the treaties of Tilsit in 1807. These treaties ended the War of the Fourth Coalition, which had involved Britain, Prussia, Russia, and other states opposing France. Under the agreements, Russia promised to follow Napoleon's economic restrictions, including the Continental System. In practice, however, Russia continued trading with Britain. Russian merchants and officials found ways to bypass French restrictions because Britain was a major source of goods and finance. By 1810, the disagreement over trade enforcement became a serious political issue. Napoleon demanded stricter compliance. Tsar Alexander I resisted because strict enforcement would harm the Russian economy. The tension between Napoleon and Alexander created a fragile political situation that could collapse into war. Napoleon decided that military action was necessary to enforce the Continental System and to demonstrate French power. He also saw the invasion of Russia as an opportunity to strengthen his control over Eastern Europe and to remove Russia as a threat to French interests. The French government and military leadership began extensive preparations. This plan involved assembling a massive army, organizing supply lines, and planning the route of invasion. Napoleon believed that the campaign could be completed quickly if the Russian army was defeated early. He assumed that the Russian army would either surrender after a few battles or retreat in a way that would allow the Grande Armée to occupy key cities, including Moscow. The army assembled for the invasion was the largest Europe had seen. It was called the Grande Armée. Estimates of its size range from 600,000 to over 650,000 men. These troops came from France and from allied states controlled by Napoleon. The army included French, Polish, Italian, German, and other European contingents. The invasion began in the summer of 1812. The army assembled in East Prussia, which is the modern-day parts of Poland and Lithuania. Supply depots were pre-positioned along the planned route to provide food and equipment to troops as they advanced. Roads were generally poor, and distances between supply points were large. Napoleon planned the campaign assuming that the Russian army would not resist strongly and that the Grande Armée could advance quickly. He also assumed that local populations would provide some supplies. However, these assumptions were incorrect. The Russian strategy relied on avoiding major confrontations at the beginning of the campaign. Russian commanders, primarily General Barclay de Tolly and General Bagration, planned to retreat strategically while destroying resources that could be used by the French. They burned crops, villages, and towns along the route of the French advance. This approach, known as a scorched earth policy, made it difficult for the Grande Armée to find food and shelter. The geographical and climatic conditions presented additional challenges. The distances to be covered in Russia were far greater than in previous campaigns. Roads were often dirt tracks, difficult to move large numbers of men, horses, and artillery. Bridges were limited, and rivers could slow the advance or block it entirely. The summer of 1812 was warmer than usual in parts of Russia, which increased the risk of heat exhaustion and disease among troops. Troops were theoretically well equipped, but supplies were insufficient for such a large army over a long campaign. Food for men and forage for horses were limited. Medicine and medical care were also insufficient for the army's needs. Napoleon understood the importance of morale in large armies, and he attempted to motivate his troops through proclamations and personal presence. The Grande Armée carried banners, symbols, and Napoleon's orders intended to inspire confidence. Despite this, the army faced problems even before entering Russia. Desertion and disease began reducing troop numbers. Illnesses such as dysentery, typhus, and respiratory infections spread rapidly among soldiers living in crowded conditions. The logistical strain also caused difficulties in distributing food and ammunition, even in the early stages. The Russian army did not attempt to confront the French in a decisive battle during the initial weeks. Barclay de Tolly and Bagration focused on delaying tactics and strategic withdrawals. By retreating in good order, the Russians allowed the French to advance, but at the cost of overextending supply lines and exhausting troops. Russian forces destroyed resources along the route, leaving little for foraging. This meant that French troops had to carry more supplies with them, slowing their movement and increasing fatigue. By 1812, Europe had been shaped by nearly 2 decades of Napoleonic warfare. Napoleon Bonaparte, who rose to power in France after the Revolution, established himself as emperor in 1804. Since then, he had pursued a combination of military conquest, political alliances, and economic control to secure French dominance over the continent. Through a series of campaigns, including the War of the Third Coalition, 1805, the War of the Fourth Coalition, 1806 to 1807, and the War of the Fifth Coalition, 1809, Napoleon had defeated most major European powers or forced them into alliances. France's political influence extended across Western and Central Europe. Territories such as Italy, the Confederation of the Rhine, and satellite states were directly controlled or strongly influenced by France. The European political landscape at this time was characterized by the balance of power disrupted in favor of France, with Britain remaining as a consistent opponent due to its naval supremacy and economic strength. One of the primary instruments of Napoleon's continental strategy was the Continental System. Implemented in 1806 following the Berlin Decree, the Continental System aimed to blockade British trade across Europe. Napoleon's objective was to weaken Britain economically and diplomatically by preventing the import and export of goods between Britain and continental Europe. France required European states to comply with this policy. The Continental System was enforced through decrees, customs inspections, and military measures. The blockade affected trade routes, tariffs, and the economies of the nations involved, creating tension among allied and neutral states. Nations such as Spain, the Netherlands, and the German states were obligated to follow the system, while Britain relied on its navy to maintain maritime trade and its colonies to support its economy. Russia initially accepted the terms of the Continental System after the Treaties of Tilsit in 1807. These treaties concluded the War of the Fourth Coalition, which had involved France, Prussia, Russia, and Britain. At Tilsit, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I of Russia reached agreements on political boundaries, trade restrictions, and alliance obligations. Russia agreed to limit trade with Britain and cooperate with France in maintaining the blockade. In practice, Russia continued trading with Britain, both directly and through third-party merchants in the Baltic region. The Russian economy, dependent in part on British manufactured goods and trade, resisted strict enforcement. By 1810, the Russian government had not fully complied with French demands. Napoleon interpreted this as a violation of agreements and a challenge to his authority in Europe. The economic disagreements between France and Russia were compounded by political and military concerns. Napoleon was aware that Russia's reluctance to enforce the blockade weakened his strategic position. He feared that Russian trade with Britain allowed the British economy to remain strong, which could fund military operations against France. Additionally, Napoleon sought to reinforce France's hegemony over Eastern Europe, including Poland and the states bordering Prussia and Austria. A successful campaign against Russia would secure the eastern flank of his empire and demonstrate the strength of French military power. In addition to economic and political motives, Napoleon sought to resolve potential threats to French dominance before they could expand. The Russian army, though smaller than the Grande Armée, was capable of defending the country's territory and resisting French control. Tsar Alexander I's policies were increasingly independent, and Russian forces had been mobilizing and improving their organization. Napoleon assessed that delaying action would allow Russia more time to strengthen defenses. He calculated that a quick and decisive campaign would force Russia to comply with his demands, weaken the Russian military, and expand French influence further into Eastern Europe. In preparation for military action, Napoleon began extensive planning. This involved not only mobilizing the Grande Armée, but also establishing supply chains, identifying routes of advance, and coordinating Allied forces. The army would need to cross large distances in Russia, where the infrastructure was limited and conditions could be harsh. Napoleon assumed that his forces could achieve rapid victories in early engagements, which would then allow the army to capture key cities, including Smolensk and ultimately Moscow. He anticipated that Russian commanders would either surrender after a few battles or retreat in a manner that allowed French forces to occupy territory without prolonged resistance. The Grande Armée was assembled in East Prussia and neighboring territories in early 1812. The army included approximately 600,000 men, making it the largest military force assembled in European history up to that point. Artillery strength was a critical component of the Grande Armée. The force included approximately 1,200 guns distributed among infantry, cavalry, and independent artillery units. Cavalry units totaled approximately 45,000 horses, divided between heavy and light cavalry, with roles in reconnaissance, flanking, and pursuit operations. Infantry formations were organized into battalions, brigades, and corps, designed to operate independently or together as coordinated units. This hierarchical structure allowed Napoleon to concentrate forces for decisive engagements while maintaining operational flexibility across the large army. Logistical planning was a central concern for the campaign. Supply depots were prepositioned along the projected route of advance, with estimates for food, forage, ammunition, and medical supplies. Roads in Eastern Europe, particularly in Prussia, Lithuania, and Russia, were generally unpaved, often becoming impassable in rain or due to heavy traffic. Napoleon assumed the campaign would be short, which would reduce the burden on supply lines. However, This assumption underestimated the distances to be covered, the challenges posed by Russian defensive tactics, and the potential for environmental obstacles. The Russian military strategy was focused on defense, retreat, and attrition. Generals Barclay de Tolly and Bagration commanded the main Russian armies. They planned to avoid decisive engagement in the initial weeks of the invasion, trading space for time. Their strategy relied on delaying actions, limited skirmishes, and systematic withdrawal to preserve the army while stretching French supply lines. The Russians also implemented a scorched earth policy. Villages, towns, and crops along the route of the French advance were burned or removed, denying the invaders access to food and shelter. Civilians were displaced or instructed to evacuate towns before the arrival of French forces. European summer conditions in 1812 were a factor in planning and operations. Temperatures varied across regions, with some areas experiencing unusually warm weather. Troops were housed in temporary camps, often crowded and lacking sanitation. Disease spread quickly under these conditions, including dysentery, typhus, and respiratory infections. The large size of the army magnified these risks. Even before the campaign began, desertions occurred, particularly among Allied contingents who were less motivated to fight outside their homelands. Napoleon anticipated that rapid victories would maintain morale and reduce attrition. Proclamations and orders emphasized discipline, duty, and loyalty. However, logistical challenges and Russian defensive measures were already creating strain. Supply shortages emerged, even in the initial stages of mobilization. Horses required large amounts of fodder, which could not be reliably provided along the route. Infantry troops depended on daily rations of bread and meat, which were limited due to storage, transportation, and the destruction of resources by the Russian retreat. By the time the Grande Armée prepared to cross the Niemen River, the campaign's conditions were already testing the limits of planning and organization. The army was well trained in formation, drill, and coordination. Commanders were experienced in previous campaigns across Europe. However, the scale of the operation, the distances to be covered, and the uncertainties of the Russian response created risks. The combination of political objectives, military planning, and environmental factors set the stage for what would become the 1812 Russian campaign. The invasion was not merely a military operation. It was a political act intended to enforce economic policy, demonstrate power, and consolidate French influence in Eastern Europe. By early 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte had begun assembling the largest military force in European history to invade Russia. This army, known as the Grande Armée, would include French troops as well as forces from Allied states under Napoleon's control. The goal of the assembly was to create a force capable of operating across vast distances, engaging the Russian army, and enforcing the continental system. The preparation of this army involved extensive recruitment, organization, logistics, and coordination of multiple national contingents. The composition, structure, and readiness of the Grande Armée reflected both Napoleon's strategic ambitions and the logistical challenges of operating in Eastern Europe. The total strength of the Grande Armée is estimated at approximately 600,000 men. This included roughly 378,000 French soldiers, forming the majority of combatants. The Grande Armée was organized into corps, each commanded by a marshal or senior general with operational independence. This organizational structure allowed Napoleon to control the overall campaign while permitting corps commanders to operate semi-autonomously on the battlefield. Marshals such as Louis-Nicolas Davout, Michel Ney, Joachim Murat, Jean-Baptiste Bessières, and Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte held command positions over specific corps, divisions, or specialized units. Each corps consisted of infantry, cavalry, and artillery components designed to operate as a combined force capable of independent maneuver. Infantry units were organized into battalions and brigades, with clear chains of command. Cavalry units were divided into heavy cavalry, light cavalry, and dragoons. Artillery units were distributed across corps and included foot and horse artillery, totaling approximately 1,200 guns. The cavalry of the Grande Armée played multiple roles. Heavy cavalry, including cuirassiers, was used to break enemy formations and pursue retreating forces. Light cavalry, including hussars and chasseurs, was used for reconnaissance, skirmishing, and raiding supply lines. Dragoons combined elements of both heavy and light cavalry, capable of fighting both mounted and dismounted. Cavalry units required large numbers of horses, approximately 45,000 in total, which added to logistical complexity. Horses required daily feed and water, creating significant supply demands, particularly when operating in regions with limited resources. Artillery was a critical component of the Grande Armée's combat effectiveness. Napoleon emphasized mobile artillery capable of supporting infantry attacks and responding to battlefield conditions. Each corps had artillery brigades with a mix of field guns, howitzers, and heavier pieces. Artillery units were responsible for both offensive bombardments and defensive support. The distribution of guns across corps allowed Napoleon to concentrate firepower during critical phases of battle while maintaining flexibility across a wide operational area. Logistics for the campaign were a major concern from the outset. Supply depots were established along the projected route of advance, extending from East Prussia into Russian territory. Roads in Eastern Europe were generally unpaved, uneven, and prone to disruption by weather. Rain could turn dirt roads into mud, slowing the movement of troops, artillery, and supply wagons. The distances between depots were substantial, often exceeding the carrying capacity of traditional supply lines. Napoleon assumed the campaign would be swift, but the size of the army and the distances involved presented inherent risks. Provisions included food for soldiers, forage for horses, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Despite careful planning, shortages were anticipated, particularly if Russian forces avoided decisive engagement or used scorched earth tactics. Recruitment and training were ongoing in the months leading up to the invasion. French conscripts were supplemented by experienced veterans who had served in previous campaigns across Europe. Allied contingents varied in quality, experience, and motivation. Polish troops, for example, were generally well-trained and committed due to political aspirations linked to Napoleon's support for the Duchy of Warsaw. Italian and German troops were integrated into the French command system, but often had limited operational experience. Maintaining discipline and cohesion across a multinational army of this size required extensive staff coordination, clear orders, and consistent enforcement of regulations. Medical care and sanitation were limited. Disease was a significant concern in assembled armies of the period. Dysentery, typhus, and respiratory infections could spread quickly in crowded camps. Field hospitals were established, but their capacity was limited relative to the number of troops. Efforts to maintain hygiene included routine inspections, designated camp areas, and limited medical personnel. Despite these measures, illness and minor injuries were expected to reduce operational strength even before the army entered Russian territory. Transportation of artillery, supplies, and troops relied on both human and animal resources. Wagons, carts, and pack animals were used to carry provisions, ammunition, and equipment. The large number of horses required fodder and water at regular intervals. Roads, rivers, and bridges presented obstacles to movement. Napoleon planned multiple routes of march to ensure flexibility in response to Russian actions. Corps commanders received detailed instructions on positioning, timing, and coordination. Staff officers were responsible for communication between headquarters and subordinate units. Coordination among Allied contingents required additional planning. Language barriers, differing military traditions, and varied command structures created challenges. Napoleon and his marshals issued standardized orders, drills, and signals to reduce confusion. Liaison officers were assigned to each corps to ensure communication across French and Allied units. Despite these efforts, operational delays were anticipated due to the scale of the army and differences among contingents. The assembly of the Grande Armée also included provisions for administrative and support functions. Engineers, sappers, and surveyors were attached to the corps to construct bridges, repair roads, and maintain infrastructure during the march. Quartermaster units were responsible for managing supplies, transport, and camp arrangements. Clerks and staff officers maintained records, troop strength reports, and logistical data. These administrative units were essential to sustaining the army across extended lines of advance. Discipline and morale were emphasized throughout the assembly. Orders prohibited looting, misconduct, and insubordination, with penalties established for violations. Napoleonic codes of conduct were enforced to maintain order among troops. Proclamations and addresses reminded soldiers of their duty to the emperor, the state, and the objectives of the campaign. These measures were intended to maintain cohesion in a force that included multiple nationalities, varying levels of training, and diverse cultural backgrounds. Even at this stage, some challenges were evident. Desertion occurred among less motivated troops, particularly in Allied contingents not committed to French strategic goals. Disease and minor injuries affected operational readiness. Supply estimates, though carefully calculated, were vulnerable to disruption by terrain, weather, and enemy action. The Russian Army's anticipated strategy of retreat and resource denial posed an additional risk to sustaining the Grande Armée once it entered Russian territory. In preparation for deployment, the Grande Armée conducted exercises, inspections, and marches to ensure readiness. Corps and divisions practiced formation movements, artillery deployment, and coordinated maneuvers. Cavalry units conducted reconnaissance, patrols, and mock charges. Infantry units drilled in attack and defense formations. Artillery crews trained on range, targeting, and rapid deployment. These exercises were essential for ensuring that the army could operate effectively once it encountered Russian forces or navigated the logistical challenges of the campaign. By early June 1812, the Grande Armée was assembled in East Prussia and the surrounding territories. Troops were concentrated near key points along the planned route of advance. Supply depots were stocked, staff officers assigned, and reconnaissance conducted along the projected paths. Napoleon issued final orders, emphasizing the need for rapid advance, coordination among corps, and preparation for engagement with Russian forces. The army's scale, combined with its multinational composition and logistical complexity, represented both its strength and its vulnerability. The beginning of Napoleon's invasion of Russia is marked by the crossing of the Niemen River, which occurred on June 24, 1812. The river was a natural boundary separating East Prussia from Russian-controlled territories in the area that is now Lithuania. The crossing represented the first operational move of the Grande Armée into Russian lands. The Grande Armée had been assembled and organized for several months in East Prussia, with corps positioned to advance along multiple roads. The crossing of the Niemen was both a logistical and operational challenge, requiring coordination among thousands of troops, cavalry, artillery units, and supply trains. The French and Allied forces had advanced toward the river in preparation for the crossing. Reconnaissance had identified fords, bridges, and potential crossing points. The Army's engineers and sappers were tasked with preparing temporary bridges, improving existing structures, and securing safe passage for troops and artillery. Multiple crossing points were used to avoid congestion and allow the simultaneous movement of corps. Commanders coordinated movement to prevent bottlenecks and to maintain operational security. The Grande Armée was organized into corps for the crossing. Each corps included infantry divisions, cavalry brigades, and artillery batteries. Infantry units were responsible for securing the riverbanks and advancing once the crossing was complete. Cavalry provided reconnaissance, screened movements, and prepared to pursue or counter enemy forces. Artillery units were positioned to support the crossing and to provide defensive fire against potential Russian resistance. Supply trains, carrying provisions, ammunition, and equipment, followed the corps in an organized sequence, with engineers ensuring that wagons could traverse temporary crossings and muddy terrain. Troop numbers at the crossing were considerable. Estimates placed the Grande Armée at over 600,000 men, though not all were concentrated at the same crossing points simultaneously. Corps were staggered across different sectors to reduce congestion and to maintain the ability to respond to any Russian engagement. French troops were supported by Polish, Italian, German, and other Allied contingents, integrated under French command. The multinational composition of the army required additional staff coordination to ensure communication and synchronization across diverse units. The Russian army, commanded primarily by General Barclay de Tolly, had adopted a strategy of retreat and delaying tactics. Russian forces avoided full-scale confrontation at the Niemen, withdrawing eastward in good order. This allowed the Grande Armée to cross the river without engaging in a major battle. Russian forces conducted limited skirmishes and reconnaissance along the riverbanks, probing French positions and monitoring troop movements. They employed light cavalry units and irregular forces, such as Cossacks, to harass forward elements, gather intelligence, and slow the French advance. Russian forces were careful not to become decisively engaged, preserving strength for subsequent operations further east. The crossing began on June 24, 1812, and extended over several days, concluding around June 29. The operation required the construction and maintenance of temporary bridges and the use of fords. Engineers and sappers worked continuously to ensure that artillery, cavalry, and supply trains could traverse the river. Infantry units led the crossings, often moving in successive waves to establish secure positions on the far bank. Artillery was moved across using pontoons, reinforced bridges, and ferries. The movement of large numbers of horses and wagons created logistical challenges, as riverbanks were often muddy and unstable, and heavy rainfall occasionally disrupted operations. French command emphasized the importance of speed and order during the crossing. Staggered movement schedules allowed corps to advance in sequence while maintaining the ability to support one another. Rearguard units were assigned to protect against potential Russian attacks during the crossing. Cavalry detachments conducted reconnaissance along the eastern bank to identify Russian positions, monitor terrain, and secure routes of advance. These operations were critical to ensuring that the Grande Armée maintained cohesion and readiness once it entered Russian territory. The crossing of the Niemen was a significant test of the Grande Armée's logistical and operational capabilities. Moving hundreds of thousands of men, tens of thousands of horses, artillery pieces, and supply wagons across a river required precise coordination, disciplined troops, and effective staff work. Delays or mismanagement could have led to congestion, loss of equipment, or vulnerability to Russian attacks. The French command structure, with Napoleon at the top and marshals managing corps, provided the necessary hierarchical organization to execute the operation efficiently. During the crossing, supply challenges became evident. The army had anticipated foraging opportunities in Russian territory, but Russian forces employed scorched earth tactics, burning crops and evacuating villages ahead of the French advance. This meant that the Grande Armée had to rely heavily on prepositioned supplies carried from East Prussia. Wagons were loaded with bread, meat, flour, fodder for horses, and medical provisions. Engineers ensured that supply trains could cross temporary bridges, but the volume of supplies relative to the number of troops was limited, and rationing began even at this early stage. Troop morale was generally high during the crossing, supported by Napoleon's presence and the momentum of movement into Russian territory. However, operational challenges, including long marches, poor roads, and the heat of late June, affected soldiers physically. Units had to maintain discipline under conditions of fatigue and logistical stress. Cavalry and artillery horses were particularly vulnerable to exhaustion, with some animals collapsing or requiring replacement. Troops were instructed to conserve energy, maintain formation, and follow orders to prevent disruption during the crossing. The Russian strategy of retreat continued to influence French operations. Barclay de Tolly's forces withdrew eastward in an organized manner, establishing defensive positions along secondary lines of retreat. Skirmishes occurred as Russian light cavalry and Cossacks probed French positions, capturing stragglers and raiding supply lines. These actions did not significantly impede the crossing, but served to warn French commanders of the need to maintain security and coordination. French forces engaged in limited counter-skirmishes, deploying light cavalry to protect flanks and rear guards to maintain order among advancing infantry. Coordination among multinational units was particularly important during the crossing. Orders were issued in French, with liaison officers assigned to communicate instructions to Polish, Italian, German, and other Allied contingents. This reduced the risk of miscommunication, ensured proper placement of units on the eastern bank, and allowed for coordinated movements across multiple crossing points. Each corps maintained internal organization, with infantry leading, artillery following, and cavalry screening and scouting. Supply trains moved in parallel sequences to avoid congestion and bottlenecks. By June 29, 1812, the Grande Armée had successfully crossed the Niemen River and established initial positions in Russian territory. The operation demonstrated the Army's capacity for large-scale coordinated movement, the effectiveness of corps organization, and the logistical planning required to sustain a multinational force over difficult terrain. Despite the absence of a major engagement at the river, the crossing served as a preliminary operational test for the Grande Armée, highlighting both strengths and vulnerabilities. Strengths included disciplined troops, flexible command, and engineering capability. Vulnerabilities included reliance on supply lines, exposure to weather, and the challenges of maintaining cohesion among diverse contingents. The crossing of the Niemen also set the stage for subsequent operations deeper into Russian territory. The Grande Armée was now fully inside Russia, and its logistical system was extended into areas where local resources were scarce due to Russian retreat and scorched earth tactics. Commanders understood that the effectiveness of supply, reconnaissance, and troop coordination would be critical in upcoming engagements. Napoleon's assumption that the campaign could proceed rapidly would soon be tested as distances increased, roads deteriorated, and Russian defensive actions intensified. In addition to the physical crossing, operational planning considered future movement and security. Cavalry patrols were dispatched along likely routes of advance to identify Russian positions, assess terrain, and monitor potential ambush points. Engineers surveyed roads and bridges to ensure that artillery and supply trains could continue to move without obstruction. Corps commanders coordinated timing and positioning to maintain a continuous line of march, allowing the Army to concentrate forces for future engagements while minimizing the risk of stragglers or isolated units being attacked. The initial movement across the Niemen also provided insight into the challenges the Grande Armée would face in Russia. The distance between corps increased as units advanced at different speeds, creating gaps that could be exploited by enemy forces. Roads were narrow and often unsuitable for heavy wagons and artillery. Supply trains struggled to keep pace with rapidly moving infantry, requiring constant attention from quartermasters and staff officers. Horses fatigued quickly under these conditions, limiting cavalry effectiveness. These operational factors were critical in the weeks that followed as the French advanced toward Vilna, Vitebsk, and beyond. By the end of the Niemen crossing, Napoleon had achieved a significant operational milestone. The Grande Armée was fully inside Russian territory, capable of advancing toward strategic objectives. The Russian army had avoided major confrontation, preserving strength for subsequent battles, while employing scorched earth tactics to disrupt French logistics. The crossing demonstrated the Grande Armée's ability to conduct large-scale river operations, coordinate multinational forces, and manage complex supply chains. However, it also revealed the inherent risks of operating deep in enemy territory over extended supply lines, with environmental and logistical factors likely to influence the campaign's outcome. After crossing the Niemen River between the 24th and the 29th of June 1812, the Grande Armée began its advance toward Vilna, a key city in the Lithuanian region under Russian control. This phase of the campaign marked the first extended movement into Russian territory, testing the army's organization, logistics, and operational discipline. The march to Vilna involved coordination of infantry, cavalry, artillery, and supply trains over roads that were often narrow, unpaved, and difficult to traverse. The army faced environmental challenges, logistical constraints, and initial Russian resistance in the form of strategic retreat and scorched earth measures. The Grande Armée continued to operate under the corps system established by Napoleon. Corps were organized into divisions, brigades, and battalions, with each commander responsible for maintaining formation, discipline, and coordination. Infantry units led the march, with artillery units moving behind or alongside them, while cavalry conducted reconnaissance, screened movements, and monitored potential Russian activity. Supply trains followed in a regulated sequence to prevent congestion and maintain the pace of advance. The army was supported by engineers, sappers, and staff officers who ensured that bridges, roads, and fords remained passable. The total strength of the Grande Armée remained near 600,000 men at this stage, though operational effectiveness was already reduced by minor casualties, illness, and desertion. The army included French, Polish, Italian, and German troops, with command and communication maintained through liaison officers assigned to each corps. Supply and coordination were major challenges due to the length of the army columns and the limited infrastructure in Eastern Europe. Roads were narrow, muddy after rainfall, and often disrupted by local terrain. Artillery movement was particularly difficult, as heavy guns required reinforced paths and careful handling to prevent damage or delay. The Russian army, under General Barclay de Tolly, implemented a defensive strategy designed to slow the French advance while preserving Russian forces. Russian units avoided full-scale engagement, instead conducting strategic withdrawals to draw French forces deeper into territory with limited resources. Russian cavalry and light infantry units, including Cossacks, harassed French foraging parties, monitored movements, and disrupted communication. These actions were intended to stretch the French supply lines and reduce the effectiveness of the Grande Armée before major battles could occur. A critical feature of the Russian defensive strategy was the scorched earth policy. As the Grande Armée advanced, Russian forces destroyed crops, removed or evacuated livestock, and burned villages and towns along the route. The intent was to deprive French forces of local resources for food, fodder, and shelter. This policy forced the Grande Armée to rely heavily on prepositioned supplies carried from East Prussia, adding pressure to already extended supply lines. Foraging parties were deployed to gather any available resources, but they frequently encountered empty villages, destroyed crops, and Russian resistance. The scarcity of provisions affected both infantry and cavalry, and shortages of fodder contributed to fatigue and loss among horses. Marching through the Lithuanian countryside, the Grande Armée faced environmental and logistical challenges. Temperatures in late June and early July were generally warm, which could lead to dehydration among troops and horses. The terrain included forests, rivers, marshes, and uneven roads, which slowed movement, complicated artillery deployment, and increased the difficulty of maintaining cohesion among corps. Bridges and fords required inspection and repair by engineers to ensure safe passage for heavy wagons and artillery. Rainfall occasionally turned roads into mud, further reducing marching speed and increasing the risk of equipment breakdown. The pace of the advance was maintained through strict command and coordination. Corps commanders ensured that units moved in sequence, with infantry in the front, artillery following, and cavalry on the flanks and rear. Supply trains were directed to move in organized convoys, with engineers and quartermasters overseeing the movement of wagons, food, and ammunition. Staff officers monitored the positioning of corps along the route to prevent gaps in coverage and to maintain operational integrity. Cavalry patrols continued reconnaissance, identifying Russian positions, monitoring terrain, and providing early warning of potential attacks or obstacles. Foraging operations were a constant requirement for the Grande Armée. Troops searched for food, water, and fodder, often encountering resistance from Russian forces or local populations. Cossack units and light infantry conducted raids on foraging parties, capturing provisions and inflicting casualties among isolated soldiers. These attacks forced the French to deploy protective detachments, reducing the number of soldiers available for the main advance. The combination of long marches, scarcity of resources, and harassment by enemy units began to affect the overall strength and efficiency of the army. Troop health and discipline were maintained through established routines, though challenges were increasing. Illnesses such as dysentery, fever, and respiratory infections spread among crowded formations and encampments. Minor injuries from long marches, poor roads, and accidents contributed to reductions in operational strength. Officers enforced discipline and ensured adherence to marching orders, preventing disorder in columns and maintaining readiness for engagement. Soldiers were instructed to conserve energy, follow marching formations, and remain alert to Russian movements and potential ambushes. Cavalry operations were particularly important during the march to Vilna. Heavy cavalry units were positioned to counter any significant Russian attack and to pursue enemy forces if engaged. Light cavalry conducted reconnaissance, monitoring the terrain, identifying Russian positions, and screening French movements. Cavalry also protected the flanks and rear of the army, intercepting Cossack raids and preventing disruption of supply trains. The coordination of cavalry with infantry and artillery was essential to maintaining security and operational flexibility. The march also involved administrative and engineering tasks. Engineers repaired roads, constructed temporary bridges over streams and small rivers, and reinforced weak crossing points to ensure safe movement for artillery and wagons. Quartermasters managed the distribution of supplies, rations, and equipment, tracking consumption rates and adjusting for shortages. Staff officers maintained records of troop positions, supply levels, and operational timing to support decision-making at headquarters. These administrative measures were critical for sustaining an army of this scale in a foreign and resource-limited environment. As the Grande Armée advanced, the Russian army continued to withdraw in an organized manner, avoiding decisive battles. Barclay de Tolly and other Russian commanders sought to draw French forces deeper into Russian territory, increasing the strain on French logistics and exposing the army to environmental and operational hazards. Skirmishes with Russian cavalry and light infantry occurred frequently, causing minor casualties and compelling French forces to remain vigilant. These engagements were limited in scale but effective in slowing the French advance and testing the army's readiness for sustained operations. The approach to Vilna highlighted the difficulties of operating over extended lines of advance. Corps columns stretched over many kilometers, with coordination complicated by narrow roads and variable terrain. Communication relied on mounted couriers, messengers, and prearranged signals. Delays in movement or miscommunication could create gaps between units, leaving some segments of the army vulnerable to harassment or isolation. The Grande Armée's command structure and staff organization mitigated these risks, though operational complexity remained significant. By mid-July 1812, the Grande Armée had reached Vilna. The city itself had been partially evacuated by Russian authorities and forces following the scorched earth policy. Resources were limited, and the French found fewer supplies than anticipated. Foraging operations continued to secure what was available, but the army relied heavily on stores carried from East Prussia. The arrival at Vilna provided a brief opportunity to reorganize units, redistribute supplies, and prepare for further advance deeper into Russian territory. The march to Vilna demonstrated the strengths and vulnerabilities of the Grande Armée. Strengths included disciplined troops, effective command and control, engineering support, and logistical planning. Vulnerabilities included extended supply lines, exposure to environmental challenges, and harassment by Russian forces. The limited availability of local resources and the effects of scorched earth tactics created a dependence on prepositioned supplies and efficient transport, which would continue to influence operations as the army advanced further east. The operational experience gained during the march to Vilna informed future movements and engagements. Commanders understood the importance of maintaining order in columns, securing supply trains, and coordinating between multinational contingents. Cavalry reconnaissance and patrols provided critical intelligence on Russian movements and terrain conditions. Engineering and administrative support ensured that infrastructure limitations did not prevent the army from maintaining momentum. These lessons would be applied in subsequent stages of the campaign, including movements toward Vitebsk and Smolensk, where logistical challenges and Russian defensive measures would increase in intensity. The march to Vilna was a critical phase of the 1812 Russian campaign. The Grande Armée advanced over difficult terrain, maintained coordination among multinational forces, and faced limited Russian engagement while dealing with the effects of scorched earth tactics. Logistical and operational challenges tested the Army's capacity for sustained movement, while reconnaissance and staff coordination ensured continued readiness. By the end of this phase, French forces were positioned to continue their advance into Russian territory, prepared to engage in larger operations against the Russian army, while facing the logistical and environmental challenges that would define the campaign. After the Grande Armée reached Vilna in mid-July 1812, Napoleon directed the army's advance deeper into Russian territory. The strategic objective was to engage and defeat the Russian army while securing key logistical positions along the route toward Moscow. During this phase, the French forces approached the cities of Vitebsk and Smolensk. These locations were significant both as logistical hubs and as defensive positions held by the Russian army. The battles and movements in this period reflected the operational strategies of both sides. Napoleon's aim to decisively engage the Russian forces and the Russian strategy of defense in depth, strategic withdrawal, and scorched earth tactics. Vitebsk, located in present-day Belarus, was one of the first significant points of contact between the advancing French army and Russian forces. The Grande Armée approached the city after weeks of marching through Lithuanian and Belarusian terrain. Roads were poor, often muddy, and required constant attention from engineers and sappers to ensure passage for artillery, cavalry, and supply trains. The French columns advanced in a structured formation. Corps were staggered along multiple routes, with infantry leading, cavalry conducting reconnaissance and screening, and artillery positioned to support attacks or defensive operations. Supply convoys followed in sequence, protected by detachments of infantry and cavalry. Russian forces, commanded by Generals Barclay de Tolly and Pyotr Bagration, maintained their strategy of delaying the French advance without engaging in a full-scale battle at Vitebsk. Russian troops fortified positions, conducted limited skirmishes, and withdrew eastward to preserve their strength. Light cavalry and Cossack units harassed French reconnaissance and foraging parties. These operations inflicted minor casualties and slowed French progress, while maintaining the operational integrity of the main Russian army. The approach of the Grande Armée to Vitebsk revealed the logistical challenges posed by extended supply lines and the lack of resources due to the Russian scorched earth policy. Villages along the route were often evacuated and burned, and local crops were destroyed to prevent French foraging. The engagement at Vitebsk in late July was limited in scale. French forces conducted attacks to probe Russian defenses, but the Russians avoided decisive engagement. Skirmishes involved infantry and cavalry exchanges, artillery bombardments on fortified positions, and maneuvering to gain tactical advantage. Casualties were relatively low compared to major battles later in the campaign. The French succeeded in occupying Vitebsk, but Russian forces withdrew in good order, maintaining cohesion and avoiding encirclement. This retreat allowed the Russian army to continue its strategic withdrawal towards Smolensk while preserving combat strength. The logistical situation during the advance to Vitebsk and occupation of the city was challenging. The Grande Armée relied on prepositioned supply depots, carried provisions, and limited foraging. Horses required significant fodder, and artillery units depended on engineers to maintain roads and bridges. Poor road conditions, damage from rainfall, and the destruction of villages increased the strain on supply lines. Troops were required to march long distances under difficult conditions, resulting in fatigue and minor attrition. Engineers, quartermasters, and staff officers played a critical role in maintaining movement and operational readiness. Following Vitebsk, the Grande Armée continued its advance towards Smolensk, a city of major strategic importance due to its location on the route to Moscow and its status as a logistical center. The march to Smolensk involved extended columns over distances exceeding 300 kilometers from Vitebsk. The French Corps system continued to facilitate organization, allowing simultaneous movement along multiple roads. Infantry led, artillery followed, and cavalry conducted reconnaissance and flank security. Supply trains moved along parallel routes under the protection of detachments. Upon approach to Smolensk, French reconnaissance identified Russian defensive preparations. The Russian army, now consolidated under Generals Barclay de Tolly and Bagration, occupied fortified positions around the city. Fortifications included earthen ramparts, trenches, and barricades within the city, designed to slow the French advance and inflict maximum casualties. Russian forces adopted a strategy of defense in depth, preparing fallback positions to withdraw behind if threatened with encirclement or heavy attack. Light cavalry and Cossack units continued harassment of French foragers and reconnaissance parties, maintaining pressure on supply lines. The Battle of Smolensk took place between the 16th and the 18th of August 1812. Napoleon sought to capture the city to secure a logistical hub and to force the Russian army into decisive engagement. French forces conducted repeated attacks on the city's fortifications, including coordinated artillery bombardments, infantry assaults, and cavalry operations. Artillery played a key role in softening Russian positions, while infantry advanced in columns supported by skirmishers. Cavalry was deployed to protect flanks and pursue retreating enemy units. The battle involved intense fighting in and around the city, with both sides incurring significant casualties. Casualty estimates for the Battle of Smolensk indicate approximately 10,000 to 15,000 French losses, including killed, wounded, and missing. Russian losses were approximately 12,000 to 15,000, reflecting both combat casualties and logistical strain from retreat and reorganization. Despite the French capture of the city, Russian forces conducted an organized withdrawal, preventing encirclement or destruction. Russian troops removed supplies, destroyed remaining resources, and evacuated the civilian population where possible. This limited the practical benefits of occupying Smolensk for the French, as provisions were scarce and logistical support remained constrained. The occupation of Smolensk presented logistical and operational challenges for the Grande Armée. Supply lines extended back to East Prussia, exceeding 1,000 kilometers in some sectors. Roads remained poor, artillery movement continued to strain engineers, and foraging opportunities were minimal due to Russian scorched earth tactics. Troops required rest, resupply, and medical attention after sustained marching and engagement. The city provided limited infrastructure, as Russian defensive preparations had included deliberate destruction of supplies, bridges, and key buildings. Engineers and staff worked to repair roads and bridges to facilitate continued advance. Russian strategic objectives during this period were achieved through delay, withdrawal, and denial of resources. By avoiding decisive engagement at Vitebsk and retreating from Smolensk after defensive operations, Russian forces preserved the core of the army while forcing the French to extend supply lines and expend manpower. This strategy set the stage for subsequent engagements further east, where the French army would face increasingly difficult logistical and operational conditions. Russian commanders maintained cohesion, coordinated withdrawals, and prepared defensive positions near the approaches to Moscow, anticipating larger confrontations. Operational coordination within the Grande Armée remained critical. Corps commanders were responsible for timing attacks, maintaining formation, and protecting flanks and rear guards. Infantry units were deployed in multiple lines to sustain pressure on Russian positions, while artillery units delivered supporting fire. Cavalry conducted reconnaissance, pursued retreating forces, and screened supply trains. Engineers maintained the infrastructure to ensure that movement could continue without disruption. Staff officers coordinated communication between headquarters and subordinate units to address delays, casualties, or changes in Russian movements. Foraging and supply operations remained a persistent concern. French troops attempted to gather food, water, and fodder from surrounding areas, but Russian scorched earth tactics limited availability. Supply convoys transported provisions over extended distances, requiring protection from harassment by Russian cavalry and Cossacks. Horses and mules suffered from exhaustion due to long marches, inadequate fodder, and exposure to heat and poor terrain. Infantry units faced fatigue and minor attrition due to continuous movement, engagement, and logistical demands. The outcome of the engagements at Vitebsk and Smolensk demonstrated the operational strengths and limitations of the Grande Armée. Strengths included disciplined troops, effective artillery deployment, coordinated maneuvers among corps, and the ability to capture fortified positions. Limitations included extended supply lines, vulnerability to harassment, logistical strain, and limited availability of local resources. Russian forces achieved strategic objectives by preserving combat strength, delaying French advancement, and reducing operational benefits gained from captured territory. The battles also revealed the importance of staff coordination, reconnaissance, and engineering support. The ability to maintain movement, deploy artillery effectively, and secure supply routes determined the pace and effectiveness of operations. Cavalry reconnaissance provided critical intelligence on Russian positions and movement, allowing French commanders to adjust attack plans and maintain operational advantage. Engineers repaired damaged roads, constructed temporary bridges, and ensured artillery and supply trains could continue to move efficiently. By the end of August 1812, the Grande Armée had advanced through Vitebsk and Smolensk, sustaining casualties, facing logistical challenges, and experiencing the operational impact of Russian scorched earth tactics. The Russian army remained intact, having avoided a decisive engagement that would result in destruction or encirclement. French forces occupied Smolensk but faced limited benefits from the city's resources due to deliberate destruction by the retreating Russians. The stage was set for the advance toward the approaches to Moscow, where French forces would confront more extensive fortifications, continued Russian withdrawals, and the compounding effects of extended supply lines, fatigue, and attrition. After the capture of Smolensk in mid-August 1812, the Grande Armée faced the next phase of its advance toward Moscow. The Russian army, while having avoided decisive engagement at Vitebsk and conducted a controlled retreat from Smolensk, remained intact and operational. The French forces now had to advance across increasingly challenging terrain, over extended supply lines, and against a disciplined opponent employing defensive and delaying tactics. The road to Borodino marked a critical stage where operational, logistical, and strategic considerations became increasingly decisive for both armies. The advance toward Borodino required coordination of a large multinational force. The Grande Armée included French infantry, cavalry, and artillery, supported by Polish, Italian, German, and other Allied contingents. Command was structured according to Napoleon's corps system, which divided the army into semi-independent units, each led by a marshal or general responsible for maintaining combat readiness, supply management, and tactical operations. Infantry units continued to lead the march, while artillery moved in parallel, supported by engineers maintaining roads and crossings. Cavalry performed reconnaissance, flank protection, and harassment prevention. The roads between Smolensk and Borodino were limited in capacity and often damaged or muddy due to rainfall. Heavy artillery and supply wagons moved slowly, requiring continuous engineering support to prevent delays. Bridges were inspected and repaired, while temporary structures were constructed where necessary. The movement of hundreds of thousands of troops over long distances placed significant stress on the army's organization and logistics. Delays in one corps could affect adjacent units, requiring careful planning and coordination at all levels. Russian forces, under Generals Barclay de Tolly and Bagration, consolidated east of Smolensk and conducted continuous reconnaissance of the French advance. Their strategy focused on delaying the French while maintaining a cohesive defensive line. Russian cavalry and light infantry units engaged in skirmishes, ambushes, and harassment operations to slow French progress and disrupt supply trains. These operations inflicted casualties, forced the deployment of protective detachments, and required French commanders to allocate resources to guard vulnerable points along the route. Scorched earth tactics remained a central component of Russian strategy. Villages, farms, and stores along the route to Borodino were systematically destroyed or evacuated. Crops were burned, livestock removed, and infrastructure damaged to prevent the French from sourcing food, water, and fodder locally. The Grande Armée became increasingly dependent on supplies transported from East Prussia, requiring careful rationing and protection of supply convoys. Foraging parties encountered scarcity and harassment, reducing efficiency and increasing pressure on commanders to maintain logistical stability. The French army's operational strength during this phase was affected by attrition due to disease, exhaustion, and desertion. Troops had marched long distances over difficult terrain, exposed to heat during the day and variable weather at night. Minor illnesses, fatigue, and injuries accumulated, reducing the effectiveness of units. Engineers, medical personnel, and quartermasters worked to maintain operational readiness, treating casualties, managing supply distribution, and repairing infrastructure to prevent further degradation of effectiveness. Cavalry operations were essential along the road to Borodino. Heavy cavalry units were positioned to respond to potential Russian attacks or sudden engagement with retreating forces. Light cavalry conducted reconnaissance, providing intelligence on terrain, river crossings, and enemy positions. Screening and security were critical, as gaps in formations could be exploited by Russian forces or Cossack detachments. Cavalry also monitored and protected supply lines, preventing raids from causing logistical disruptions or isolating corps from headquarters. Command coordination remained critical. Napoleon maintained central oversight, issuing operational orders while allowing corps commanders flexibility to respond to local conditions. Marshals such as Davout, Ney, and Murat directed the movements of their corps, ensuring that columns maintained cohesion, flanks were secured, and forward units remained aligned with the Army's overall objectives. Engineers, staff officers, and liaison personnel facilitated communication between headquarters and field units, ensuring the timely execution of orders and operational adjustments in response to Russian movements. The Russian army positioned itself to defend key approaches to Borodino. Defensive preparations included fortifying natural terrain features, establishing field works, and organizing fallback positions to preserve combat strength in case of engagement. Russian commanders also deployed forces along secondary routes to maintain operational flexibility and to counter potential flanking movements by the French. Light cavalry, Cossacks, and infantry units conducted reconnaissance and limited engagements to monitor French progress and test their strength. Logistical challenges for the French increased with the distance from East Prussia. Supply trains had to traverse hundreds of kilometers over roads that were narrow, damaged, and often congested with army units. Artillery movement slowed under these conditions, requiring continuous engineer support. Food and fodder shortages began to affect troops and horses. Rations were carefully managed, and officers enforced discipline to prevent loss or misallocation of supplies. Troop fatigue required periodic halts to maintain effectiveness, while commanders balanced the need for speed with operational security and combat readiness. Troop morale during this period varied. While soldiers were generally disciplined and maintained formation, the cumulative effects of long marches, heat, scarcity of provisions, and continuous harassment by Russian units reduced operational efficiency. Fatigue affected both infantry and cavalry, and the health of horses became increasingly critical. Commanders monitored morale and readiness, rotating units where possible, and ensuring that rest periods were provided without compromising security or movement. Russian defensive actions during the advance to Borodino were consistent with strategic objectives. By avoiding decisive engagement and conducting controlled withdrawals, Russian forces preserved combat strength while imposing attritional costs on the French. Skirmishes along the route inflicted minor casualties, forced deployment of detachments to protect columns, and delayed the French advance. Russian units maintained cohesion, communication, and the ability to establish strong defensive positions near Borodino, preparing for a major confrontation while limiting the risk of encirclement or catastrophic loss. By early September, the Grande Armée had reached positions within striking distance of Borodino. The army was organized in preparation for engagement, with infantry deployed in multiple lines, artillery positioned to support attacks, and cavalry assigned to reconnaissance, flank security, and pursuit. Engineers and staff ensured roads and temporary crossings were maintained, supply lines were protected, and communication between corps and headquarters was operational. Foraging parties continued to operate under escort, securing what limited provisions were available in the region. The road to Borodino demonstrated the operational strengths and limitations of the Grande Armée. Strengths included disciplined troops, effective coordination among multinational corps, efficient deployment of artillery, and the capacity to maintain an organized advance over extended distances. Limitations included extended supply lines, vulnerability to harassment, environmental challenges, and attrition from disease and fatigue. The march also emphasized the effectiveness of the Russian strategy in preserving combat strength, delaying French movements, and reducing the practical benefits of territorial occupation. Reconnaissance and intelligence played a critical role in preparations for the Battle of Borodino. French cavalry identified Russian positions, fortifications, and fallback areas. Staff officers compiled reports on terrain, potential obstacles, and enemy troop strength. This intelligence informed decisions on troop deployment, artillery placement, and timing of assaults. Coordination between reconnaissance units, engineers, and corps commanders ensured that operational plans could adapt to Russian positions and environmental conditions. By early September 1812, both armies were positioned for the upcoming engagement at Borodino. The Grande Armée was concentrated, though reduced in operational effectiveness due to cumulative attrition and logistical challenges. Russian forces were prepared to defend key positions with fortified redoubts, earthworks, and organized fallback lines. Both sides were ready for sustained combat, having maintained organizational integrity despite the long marches, environmental difficulties, and operational demands encountered along the road to Borodino. The advance to Borodino was a test of endurance, organization, and command for both the French and Russian armies. The Grande Armée demonstrated the ability to maintain a structured advance, coordinate large formations, and protect supply lines over difficult terrain. Russian forces demonstrated strategic discipline by preserving combat strength, conducting controlled withdrawals, and preparing effective defensive positions. The stage was set for one of the largest and most consequential battles of the campaign, with both sides relying on operational planning, logistical support, and tactical coordination developed over the preceding months. By early September 1812, the Grande Armée had completed its march through Smolensk and surrounding regions, approaching positions near the village of Borodino, roughly 110 kilometers west of Moscow. The French army, under Napoleon Bonaparte, numbered approximately 130,000 men, including infantry, cavalry, and artillery, supported by multinational contingents from Allied states. The Russian army, under General Mikhail Kutuzov, had consolidated approximately 120,000 troops, prepared to defend key positions along the approaches to Moscow. Both armies had prepared for engagement over the preceding weeks through reconnaissance, fortification, and logistical organization. Borodino held strategic significance as the principal defensive position before Moscow. The terrain consisted of open fields, low hills, and forested areas, which the Russian army utilized to establish fortified positions. The primary fortifications included the Bagration flèches, a series of triangular earthworks designed to defend against frontal assaults, and the Shevardino redoubt, a fortified earthwork protecting the Russian left flank. Secondary defensive positions were established to allow the Russian army to conduct controlled withdrawals if necessary, maintaining cohesion while imposing maximum attrition on the attacking French forces. The French army was organized according to the corps system, allowing semi-independent operations under the direction of Napoleon. Each corps was composed of infantry divisions, cavalry brigades, artillery batteries, and support personnel. Marshals such as Davout, Ney, and Murat commanded major corps, responsible for maintaining order, readiness, and tactical execution. Infantry units were deployed in multiple lines to sustain pressure on Russian fortifications, while artillery units were positioned to deliver coordinated bombardments. Cavalry units conducted reconnaissance, protected flanks, and were prepared to exploit weaknesses or pursue retreating forces. Before engagement, both armies conducted reconnaissance operations to identify enemy positions and assess terrain conditions. French cavalry and light infantry skirmished with Russian outposts, mapping fortifications and monitoring troop concentrations. Russian reconnaissance similarly observed French formations, ensuring readiness to adjust defensive positions. Engineers and staff officers on both sides coordinated the preparation of field works, emplacement of artillery, and movement of supply trains to support sustained combat. The battle commenced in the morning of September 7, 1812. Initial French movements involved coordinated attacks on the Russian left flank, particularly targeting the Shevardino redoubt. Artillery bombardments preceded infantry assaults, aiming to weaken Russian defensive positions. French columns advanced in formation, with skirmishers leading to engage Russian outposts and protect the main units from defensive fire. Cavalry screened flanks, monitored enemy movements, and prevented Russian forces from executing counterattacks on supply lines or infantry columns. The Bagration flèches became a focal point of combat. Russian infantry, reinforced by artillery positioned behind the earthworks, offered strong resistance to French assaults. French forces conducted repeated attacks throughout the day, rotating units to maintain offensive pressure. Artillery units delivered sustained bombardments, targeting fortifications, Russian artillery, and troop concentrations. Infantry assaults involved coordinated movement in lines and columns to minimize exposure to defensive fire while maximizing the potential for breakthrough. Fighting was intense and continuous. French units suffered heavy casualties due to the defensive strength of Russian positions and the effectiveness of artillery fire. Russian forces maintained discipline and cohesion, rotating units to reinforce positions under threat. Cossacks and light infantry engaged in flanking and harassment operations to disrupt French formations, while cavalry units were deployed to counter French advances or protect retreat routes. Engineers repaired damaged fortifications and ensured communication lines between defensive positions remained intact. Casualty figures for the Battle of Borodino indicate that French losses were approximately 30,000, including killed, wounded, and missing. Russian casualties were higher, estimated at 44,000, reflecting the intensity of frontal assaults and artillery exchanges. Despite these losses, neither army achieved a decisive operational advantage during the engagement. Russian defensive positions held against repeated French attacks, while the French army captured some forward positions but failed to break the main defensive line. Napoleon did not commit the Imperial Guard decisively during the battle. The decision not to employ the Guard in full strength preserved the elite unit for potential exploitation later, but limited the possibility of achieving a decisive breakthrough on September 7th. French forces captured portions of the Bagration flèches and other forward positions, but Russian units conducted organized withdrawals to secondary defensive lines, maintaining the integrity of the army and its ability to continue operations. Logistical and operational coordination during the battle was critical. French supply trains were positioned to provide ammunition, rations, and medical support. Engineers ensured artillery could be repositioned as required, and staff officers monitored troop deployments to prevent gaps in the line. Russian supply and medical operations were similarly organized, with reserves positioned to reinforce threatened sectors and maintain operational continuity. Both armies demonstrated the capacity to sustain combat over an extended period despite significant casualties and environmental stressors. Troop effectiveness was influenced by cumulative fatigue from preceding marches, skirmishes, and logistical challenges. Infantry units faced exhaustion from continuous combat and exposure, while artillery crews experienced physical strain moving and operating guns under fire. Cavalry units required management of horse stamina and fodder, particularly given the limited availability of resources due to the scorched earth policy implemented by Russian forces along the advance route. Commanders monitored unit effectiveness and rotated personnel where possible to maintain operational readiness. The terrain at Borodino influenced the flow of the battle. Open fields allowed coordinated artillery fire, while low hills and forested patches were used by both sides to conceal troop movements and fortifications. Russian defensive positions utilized natural elevation to maximize the effectiveness of artillery and infantry fire. French commanders adjusted their attacks based on terrain, concentrating forces on perceived weak points while maintaining reserves to respond to Russian counterattacks. Cavalry operations continued throughout the battle. Heavy cavalry units were deployed to exploit breakthroughs or counter Russian counterattacks, while light cavalry conducted reconnaissance, pursued retreating units, and screened supply trains. Russian cavalry similarly protected flanks, monitored French movements, and disrupted French foraging and communication lines. Coordination between cavalry, infantry, and artillery was essential to maintain battlefield cohesion and respond to dynamic developments. Engineering support remained critical during the battle. French engineers assisted in clearing obstacles, maintaining roads for artillery movement, and repairing bridges or fords to facilitate mobility. Russian engineers reinforced earthworks, repaired damaged fortifications, and ensured the functionality of defensive positions. Both armies relied on engineers to support sustained combat, maintain operational flexibility, and prevent breakdowns in command and control due to terrain or structural damage. Command decision-making was decisive in maintaining control over formations and sustaining operational effectiveness. Napoleon issued strategic and tactical orders to marshals, directing attacks, reserves, and artillery deployment. Russian commanders, led by Kutuzov, coordinated defense, rotations of troops, and reinforcement of threatened positions. Staff officers facilitated communication between headquarters and field units, ensuring that decisions could be implemented efficiently despite the scale of the battlefield and the intensity of combat. By late afternoon on September 7th, French forces had gained limited ground but had failed to destroy or decisively defeat the Russian army. Russian forces conducted controlled withdrawals to secondary defensive positions, maintaining cohesion, artillery support, and readiness for further engagement. Casualties were managed through field hospitals and medical detachments, while supply lines were adjusted to account for losses and ongoing operational demands. The battle demonstrated the resilience and discipline of both armies. The Grande Armée was able to conduct repeated attacks against fortified positions and maintain operational coordination despite heavy losses. The Russian army preserved combat strength, imposed attritional costs on the French, and maintained the capability to continue defensive operations. Both sides utilized artillery, infantry, cavalry, and engineering support in a coordinated manner to sustain operations over the course of the day. By the end of the battle, neither side achieved a decisive operational victory. French forces captured forward positions and inflicted significant casualties, but the Russian army remained intact and operational. Russian defensive success preserved the ability to continue resistance during the French advance toward Moscow. French operational objectives were partially met, but the failure to decisively defeat the Russian army required continued engagement and planning for further operations eastward. The Battle of Borodino set the stage for the French occupation of Moscow while highlighting operational, logistical, and tactical realities for both armies. The Grande Armée remained a substantial force but faced mounting challenges in terms of supply, troop fatigue, and environmental conditions. Russian forces, though tactically withdrawn, preserved strategic capability and were prepared to continue defensive operations. The battle demonstrated the capacity of both armies to conduct large-scale, coordinated combat operations, the importance of fortifications and field works, and the necessity of maintaining operational cohesion under heavy casualties. The aftermath of the engagement required immediate attention to wounded personnel, supply management, and reorganization of units. French corps were repositioned to secure captured positions, redistribute artillery, and prepare for further movement toward Moscow. Russian forces established new defensive positions east of Borodino, continuing their strategic withdrawal while maintaining readiness for potential French pursuit or engagement. Coordination of logistics, troop rotation, and communication was critical for both armies to sustain operational effectiveness following the intense engagement of September 7th, 1812. Following the Battle of Borodino, the Grande Armée advanced toward Moscow, approximately 110 kilometers to the east. Napoleon's objective was to secure the Russian capital, force Tsar Alexander I into negotiations, and compel Russian compliance with the continental system. The French army, numbering roughly 100,000 to 120,000 combat-effective troops after Borodino, advanced in organized columns supported by artillery, cavalry, and multinational contingents. The Russian army, having conducted an organized withdrawal, maintained operational integrity and avoided decisive engagement, allowing the French to enter Moscow but preserving the capability to continue defensive operations. The approach to Moscow involved coordination across multiple corps of the Grande Armée. Infantry divisions advanced along several parallel routes to maintain formation and reduce congestion, while artillery moved in proximity to support potential engagement. Cavalry conducted reconnaissance, screening, and flank protection. Engineers repaired roads, ensured mobility across minor rivers and fords, and maintained bridges for supply convoys. Supply trains transported provisions over increasingly stretched lines from Smolensk and East Prussia. Logistical strain grew as the army moved deeper into territory cleared of resources due to Russian scorched earth tactics. On September 14, 1812, French forces reached the outskirts of Moscow. The city was largely abandoned by its inhabitants, including civilians and administrative personnel. Russian military units withdrew to positions outside or around the city, leaving the French able to occupy the urban center without encountering organized resistance. Napoleon entered the city with the expectation that occupation would provide logistical support, supplies, and a political advantage through negotiation with Tsar Alexander I. Upon entry, the French found Moscow largely devoid of usable resources. Buildings, warehouses, and granaries had been emptied or destroyed by Russian authorities. Fires broke out in multiple locations, resulting from both accidental ignition and deliberate actions by retreating Russian forces. The city's infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and supply points, had been compromised. Attempts to establish supply distribution within the city were limited by the destruction and lack of available resources. Engineers and military administrators worked to organize the occupation, but conditions remained challenging. The French army established headquarters, garrisoned key districts, and organized patrols to maintain order in the abandoned city. Troops occupied buildings, set up field kitchens, and distributed remaining provisions. Medical services treated wounded soldiers from previous engagements, particularly those from Borodino. Supply officers coordinated convoys arriving from Smolensk and beyond, though the scarcity of local food, fodder, and firewood made sustained occupation difficult. Cavalry continued to patrol the surrounding areas, monitoring potential Russian movements and preventing raids on supply lines. Negotiations with Tsar Alexander I did not occur. The Russian government refused to engage diplomatically, and Russian forces remained positioned outside Moscow. Napoleon's expectation of using the city as leverage failed to materialize. The French command considered options for advancing military or political objectives, including holding Moscow to force Russian compliance or preparing for continued operations deeper into Russian territory. The lack of resources and resistance to negotiation complicated these strategic considerations. Over the course of 6 weeks, from mid-September to late October, the French army remained in Moscow. Occupation posed significant operational challenges. Supply shortages became acute due to the absence of local provisions and extended supply lines. Food, water, and fodder for horses were scarce. Troop fatigue, disease, and exposure contributed to reductions in effective combat strength. Engineering units continued to maintain roads, temporary bridges, and movement corridors, ensuring that artillery and supply trains could operate despite urban destruction and poor infrastructure. Russian forces did not remain idle. Cossack units and light cavalry conducted raids in the vicinity of Moscow, targeting French foraging parties, supply convoys, and communication lines. These operations increased the difficulty of maintaining logistical stability and imposed attritional pressure on French troops. Reconnaissance units monitored French positions and movements, ensuring that Russian commanders remained informed of the occupation's operational impact and prepared for potential counteroffensive actions. Fire incidents in Moscow were widespread. Multiple districts were affected, with fires consuming residential, commercial, and administrative structures. The destruction was systematic in many cases, aimed at denying the French usable infrastructure and supplies. The Grande Armée was forced to allocate units to firefighting and security, reducing operational flexibility for movement, reconnaissance, and logistical operations. The scale of destruction limited the city's value as a base for extended operations or as a supply hub. Troop morale during the occupation reflected operational strain. Soldiers faced shortages of food, inadequate shelter in damaged buildings, and exposure to urban hazards. Diseases, including dysentery and typhus, spread due to poor sanitation and crowded conditions. Commanders implemented rotation of duties, maintained guard schedules, and monitored unit readiness to mitigate the effects of prolonged occupation. Cavalry units, while less affected by urban constraints, required adequate fodder and rest to maintain mobility. Strategically, the occupation of Moscow did not achieve Napoleon's political objectives. Tsar Alexander I refused to negotiate. Russian forces remained intact, and the French were unable to secure sufficient resources for sustained operations. Napoleon faced a critical decision regarding continued occupation, advance, or retreat. The extended stay in Moscow further exposed the army to logistical difficulties, environmental conditions, and the cumulative effects of attrition. Engineering operations remained essential. French engineers repaired damage to roads and bridges caused by fires, maintained access routes within the city, and ensured the functionality of artillery positions. Supply officers coordinated the distribution of remaining provisions from convoys, field kitchens, and foraging operations. Medical services continued to treat wounded and sick soldiers, though facilities were limited due to urban destruction. Cavalry patrols maintained security, monitored Russian positions, and protected supply operations from harassment or sudden attacks. Russian forces are prepared to continue strategic pressure on the French army. Units outside Moscow monitored movements, reinforced defensive positions, and coordinated operations with Cossack detachments for harassment and reconnaissance. The Russian army's operational strategy remained consistent: avoid decisive engagement, preserve combat strength, and exploit environmental and logistical challenges faced by the occupying French forces. By mid-October, the operational strain on the Grande Armée increased significantly. The army faced depleted rations, fatigue, and continued exposure to urban hazards. Horses weakened due to limited fodder. Artillery mobility was restricted by road damage and infrastructure loss, and infantry units experienced reduced effectiveness from cumulative illness and exposure. Commanders were required to balance maintenance of occupation, preparation for potential Russian engagement, and planning for eventual movement from Moscow. The decision to remain in Moscow for an extended period did not yield the intended strategic advantages. Napoleon's expectation of forcing the Russian surrender or negotiation was unmet. The scarcity of resources prevented adequate resupply for troops and horses. Troops continued to perform security duties, maintain positions, and organize for potential withdrawal or further offensive operations. The occupation highlighted the limitations of advancing deep into hostile territory without secured supply lines or local cooperation. Logistical operations continued under challenging conditions. Supply convoys from Smolensk and East Prussia transported provisions, artillery ammunition, and medical supplies. Engineers repaired or reinforced urban roads to facilitate the movement of heavy equipment. Troop rotation and management of fatigue were essential to maintain operational readiness. Cavalry patrols monitored external threats and prevented significant disruption from Russian raiding operations. The Grande Armée's operational capacity was sustained through continuous coordination and resource management despite severe constraints. By October 19th, Napoleon decided to order a retreat from Moscow. The lack of resources, combined with the Russian refusal to negotiate and the operational strain on troops, made continued occupation unsustainable. The army prepared for withdrawal along the southern route toward Smolensk, anticipating harassment and defensive challenges from Russian forces. Preparation involved consolidation of artillery, organization of infantry columns, allocation of cavalry for reconnaissance and protection, and coordination of supply trains for departure from the city. The occupation of Moscow from September 14th to October 19th demonstrated multiple operational factors. The Grande Armée was able to maintain order, provide limited logistical support, and occupy a major urban center without organized opposition. However, the lack of available resources, exposure to environmental and health challenges, and persistent Russian pressure limited the army's operational effectiveness. Russian forces successfully preserved combat strength, imposed attritional costs on the French, and maintained strategic initiative for subsequent engagements. On October 19, 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte ordered the Grande Armée to abandon Moscow and begin the retreat westward towards Smolensk and ultimately the Niemen River. The decision was based on the unsustainable conditions of occupation, including depleted supplies, lack of forage, disease, and extreme operational strain on both soldiers and horses. Russian forces, intact and strategically positioned, had denied the French the intended political leverage, and ongoing harassment operations threatened the army's stability. The retreat initiated a phase of the campaign that would test the Grande Armée's discipline, logistics, and resilience under increasingly adverse environmental and operational conditions. The retreat was planned along a southern route to avoid Russian forces observed along the main Smolensk road. Napoleon intended to maintain organized columns, protect supply trains, and prevent encirclement or catastrophic losses. Infantry units were arranged in march order, supported by artillery batteries positioned to respond to potential attacks. Cavalry units provided reconnaissance, screened flanks, and engaged in countermeasures against Russian harassment parties. Engineers worked to maintain roads, repair bridges, and facilitate the movement of artillery and supply convoys. From the outset, the retreat faced immediate operational challenges. Roads were damaged, narrow, and congested with the movement of hundreds of thousands of troops, artillery, and supply wagons. Fires from the previous occupation, coupled with natural obstacles and autumn weather, created difficult marching conditions. Troops were fatigued, having endured the extended occupation and were susceptible to illness and injury. Supply lines were stretched, with convoys traveling hundreds of kilometers from Smolensk and other depots, often exposed to raids by Russian light cavalry and Cossacks. Russian forces, under General Kutuzov and subordinate commanders, pursued a strategy of harassment and attrition rather than direct engagement at full strength. Cossacks and light cavalry conducted raids on supply convoys, rearguard units, and isolated infantry detachments. These operations disrupted organization, delayed movement, and caused losses in men, horses, and material. Russian infantry maintained positions to support harassment operations while remaining prepared for engagement if opportunities arose. Reconnaissance units continuously monitored French movements, reporting on column positions, fatigue levels, and potential vulnerabilities. The retreat involved complex coordination among the French corps. Infantry divisions were responsible for maintaining march order, protecting supply columns, and securing artillery movement. Artillery units were tasked with both offensive defense in case of engagement and logistical support, ensuring that cannons remained mobile despite damaged roads and terrain obstacles. Cavalry units screened the flanks and monitored Russian activity, providing intelligence and countering harassment operations. Commanders maintained strict communication between corps headquarters, staff officers, and field units to prevent gaps in the line and ensure operational cohesion. The Battle of Maloroslavets, occurring on October 24th, became a critical point during the retreat. Russian forces intercepted the French near the town, blocking the southern route Napoleon had intended to use. The engagement involved repeated assaults and counterattacks, with both sides incurring significant casualties. The French were ultimately forced to abandon the southern route, compelling a retreat along the already devastated Smolensk road. This forced movement through terrain stripped of supplies, combined with the onset of autumn weather, further strained logistics and troop endurance. Troop morale during the initial phase of the retreat was variable. Soldiers faced scarcity of food, inadequate shelter, and continuous exposure to harsh conditions. Disease, fatigue, and loss of horses diminished operational effectiveness. Commanders implemented rotation of units, organization of rearguard detachments, and enforcement of discipline to maintain cohesion. Medical personnel treated wounded and sick soldiers. The limited resources and harsh conditions reduced recovery and survival rates. Logistical operations during the retreat required constant attention. Supply convoys transported food, ammunition, and medical supplies, often under threat from Russian raiding parties. Engineers maintained roads, constructed temporary bridges, and repaired minor river crossings. Infantry units provided security for convoys, while cavalry screened approaches and reported on enemy activity. Coordination between supply trains, artillery, and field units was essential to prevent bottlenecks, maintain movement, and ensure the survival of troops and horses. Russian harassment intensified as the French columns moved through previously occupied and devastated regions. Villages along the route were burned or abandoned, crops destroyed, and livestock removed. French foraging parties encountered scarce resources and were subjected to continuous skirmishes with Cossacks and light cavalry. Artillery and baggage trains became particularly vulnerable, requiring the allocation of infantry and cavalry units for protection. Losses of horses and equipment reduced artillery mobility and compromised the Army's ability to maintain effective defensive measures. Environmental conditions during this period exacerbated operational difficulties. Temperatures began to drop, precipitation increased, and roads became muddy or impassable. Troops marched long distances under adverse conditions, leading to fatigue, illness, and exposure. Horses weakened due to limited fodder, affecting both cavalry mobility and artillery transport. Engineers and staff officers coordinated temporary solutions for river crossings, road repairs, and supply distribution to sustain movement under deteriorating environmental conditions. Cavalry operations were critical during the retreat. Light cavalry conducted continuous reconnaissance, monitored Russian troop movements, and harassed small enemy detachments to protect the main columns. Heavy cavalry was reserved for counterattacks against concentrated threats or to exploit gaps in Russian formations if opportunities arose. The French army maintained organized rearguard detachments to slow Russian pursuit. Rear guards engaged in skirmishes, artillery duels, and defensive maneuvers to allow the main columns to advance. Coordination between rearguard units and main columns was essential to prevent encirclement or excessive attrition. Commanders ensured that communication lines remained functional, allowing orders to be transmitted, reinforcements to be allocated, and units to maintain formation despite continuous enemy pressure and environmental challenges. Artillery units faced particular difficulties during the retreat. Heavy guns were slowed by mud, damaged roads, and a lack of horses. Units had to abandon some pieces due to mobility constraints, while others were destroyed to prevent capture by pursuing Russian forces. Artillery crews continued to support infantry operations where possible, providing defensive fire against Russian harassment and covering river crossings and choke points. Engineers assisted by improving roads, constructing temporary supports, and facilitating the movement of remaining guns. By the end of October, the Grande Armée faced significant reductions in operational strength. Casualties from previous battles, disease, desertion, and Russian harassment had decreased effective troop numbers substantially. Horses continued to die from starvation, overwork, or exposure, further reducing mobility for artillery and cavalry. Supply shortages became critical, requiring rationing and strict enforcement of distribution protocols. Troop fatigue and illness limited the Army's ability to maintain rapid movement or conduct organized attacks if engaged. The retreat along the Smolensk road demonstrated the strategic impact of Russian scorched earth tactics. French foraging parties were unable to acquire sufficient resources, supply trains were delayed or attacked, and local infrastructure had been destroyed. Russian operations preserved combat strength while imposing attritional costs, forcing Napoleon to adapt operational plans and adjust expectations for movement, engagement, and survival of the army. The French command implemented strict operational procedures to maintain order. Columns marched in prearranged formations, with infantry leading, artillery following, and cavalry on the flanks and in reserve. Supply convoys were protected, and field engineers ensured that roads and minor crossings were passable. Commanders monitored unit cohesion, enforced discipline, and organized rotation of troops to mitigate fatigue. Despite these measures, attrition continued due to environmental conditions, enemy action, and cumulative operational strain. The retreat to the Niemen River was marked by continuous monitoring of Russian positions. French reconnaissance reported on Cossack raids, light infantry harassment, and potential concentration of Russian forces. Commanders adjusted movement, allocation of artillery, and deployment of infantry to respond to these threats. Cavalry units were dispatched ahead into the flanks to intercept or disrupt enemy actions. Engineers prepared for river crossings, fortifications, and temporary encampments to maintain operational flexibility. Communication and staff coordination were essential during this phase. Orders from Napoleon were transmitted to corps commanders, who then relayed instructions to division and brigade leaders. Staff officers monitored adherence to orders, reported on progress, and coordinated adjustments in response to obstacles or enemy activity. Continuous reporting allowed the French command to maintain situational awareness, allocate resources, and prioritize movement despite the challenges of attrition, environmental conditions, and enemy harassment. By October 28, 1812, the Grande Armée had completed the initial phase of retreat from Moscow, having navigated the blocked southern route, engagement at Maloroslavets, and continuous harassment from Russian forces. The army remained intact as a fighting force, but had suffered substantial reductions in manpower, cavalry strength, and artillery mobility. Supply shortages, environmental exposure, and disease continued to degrade operational effectiveness. Russian forces maintained strategic initiative, preserving combat strength and preparing for continued pressure on the retreating French columns. The retreat highlighted multiple operational realities of the 1812 campaign. Russian defensive strategy, scorched earth tactics, and harassment operations effectively neutralized the strategic value of Moscow's occupation. The French army demonstrated organizational capacity to maintain order, cohesion, and mobility under extreme stress, but faced significant attritional losses that would continue throughout subsequent phases of the retreat. Commanders at all levels were required to balance movement, security, and resource management in preparation for further challenges. By early November 1812, the Grande Armée had left the vicinity of Moscow and was moving westward along the devastated Smolensk road, now reduced to a supply-depleted corridor. The retreat faced immediate and compounding challenges: extreme cold, inadequate shelter, diminishing supplies, and constant harassment from Russian forces. The army's effective strength had already declined from the original 600,000 to under 100,000 combat-ready troops. Disease, starvation, and attrition from previous engagements had drastically reduced the number of soldiers and horses, severely limiting operational mobility and the army's capacity to respond to threats. The onset of winter had a significant impact. Temperatures fell to -20 degrees Celsius to -30 degrees Celsius, with snowstorms common along the retreat path. Troops marched over frozen or muddy roads, often without sufficient clothing, footwear, or protection from the elements. Horses weakened from hunger and exhaustion struggled to pull artillery and supply wagons, resulting in abandoned or destroyed cannons. Soldiers suffered frostbite and hypothermia, which, combined with disease and malnutrition, caused rapid attrition across infantry and support units. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion as units became fragmented under environmental stress and enemy action. Russian forces, under General Kutuzov and subordinate commanders, executed a systematic strategy of harassment rather than direct engagement in full-scale battle. Like cavalry, particularly Cossacks, engaged in continuous raids against French rearguard units, supply convoys, and isolated detachments. These operations disrupted movement, delayed progress, and inflicted casualties on already weakened troops. Russian infantry occasionally established defensive positions to support harassment operations or interdict French movements through villages, forests, or river crossings. Reconnaissance units continuously monitored the French columns, reporting on formation gaps, attrition rates, and potential vulnerabilities. The retreat was organized in multiple columns to maintain order and reduce congestion along the narrow, damaged roads. Infantry divisions marched in prearranged formations, supported by artillery where possible, though much of the heavier artillery had already been abandoned due to immobility. Cavalry units screened flanks, monitored Russian movements, and conducted counter-raids to protect vulnerable supply trains and rearguard units. Engineers constructed temporary bridges, repaired damaged roads, and facilitated movement across minor rivers and streams under challenging conditions. Supply lines were under constant stress. Provisions from Smolensk and other depots were insufficient for the army's needs, and foraging was largely unproductive due to the Russian scorched earth strategy. Rations were reduced, distributed sparingly, and supplemented where possible with minimal foraging. Horses required fodder that was increasingly unavailable, leading to the collapse of artillery mobility and cavalry effectiveness. Troop fatigue, hunger, and exposure further reduced operational capacity and slowed the rate of retreat. Cavalry operations played a critical role in maintaining the army's integrity. Light cavalry units conducted reconnaissance, screened flanks, and disrupted Russian raiding parties. Heavy cavalry, limited by the number of surviving horses, was used sparingly for counterattacks or to stabilize critical points along the columns. Cavalry units also protected supply convoys, maintained communication lines, and provided rapid intelligence regarding Russian movements, allowing commanders to adjust troop formations and prioritize defensive positions along the route. Infantry faced extreme hardship. Units marched in dense columns under harsh weather, with many soldiers lacking proper clothing or footwear. Frostbite, exposure, and disease caused continuous attrition. Desertion and surrender increased as soldiers became physically incapable of continuing. Commanders enforced discipline where possible, but faced limitations due to fragmentation, fatigue, and the inability to provide adequate medical or nutritional support. Field hospitals were overwhelmed, and treatment for frostbite, dysentery, and other diseases was limited. The Russian army maintained strategic pressure through harassment and observation. Detached Cossack units attacked stragglers, supply trains, and rearguard elements. Skirmishes occurred frequently, preventing the French from establishing secure encampments or halting for sufficient rest. Russian strategy aimed to exploit environmental conditions, inflict attrition, and avoid direct engagement with the remaining organized French forces, preserving Russian combat strength for potential counteroffensives. Artillery operations were severely constrained. Heavy guns, already abandoned during previous phases of retreat, limited the ability to provide defensive fire. Remaining artillery pieces were difficult to move due to snow, ice, and insufficient horses. Crews attempted to maintain positions at critical points, such as river crossings and village choke points, but operational effectiveness was reduced by fatigue, attrition, and environmental conditions. Engineers assisted in mobility where possible, constructing makeshift sleds or clearing paths for cannons. The retreat involved continuous rearguard actions to protect the main body of the army. Rear guards engaged Russian raiding units, conducted artillery duels, and provided cover for the movement of infantry and supply columns. Coordination between the rear guard and main columns was essential to prevent encirclement and limit casualties. Commanders allocated resources dynamically to respond to threats, maintaining communication through mounted messengers and staff officers despite the challenges of fragmented units and difficult terrain. River crossings became particularly critical during November. Freezing temperatures, snow, and ice rendered some rivers impassable, while others were crossed under fire from Russian units positioned on the opposite banks. Engineers constructed temporary bridges, pontoons, and ferries, facilitating the passage of infantry, artillery, and supply trains. Rearguard units defended crossings to prevent Russian interdiction, often at the cost of significant casualties and loss of equipment. Delays at river crossings exacerbated supply shortages and fatigue across the army. Harassment by Russian forces remained persistent. Cossacks and light cavalry disrupted French movement, forcing the abandonment of artillery and baggage trains in some cases. Infantry detachments were isolated and captured, reducing overall strength. The cumulative effect of environmental exposure, disease, supply scarcity, and constant enemy pressure accelerated the collapse of the Grande Armée's operational capacity. Commanders implemented rotations and reorganization of units to maintain combat readiness wherever possible. Troop morale continued to deteriorate under extreme conditions. Soldiers faced the daily threat of death from cold, starvation, and enemy action. Desertion increased, particularly among Allied contingents less accustomed to the environmental conditions. Commanders enforced discipline, organized protective formations, and attempted to sustain movement. But the physical limitations of men and animals imposed strict operational constraints. Medical services were unable to meet the demands caused by frostbite, malnutrition, and disease, leading to high mortality rates. By mid-November, the Grande Armée had been reduced to under 50,000 effective combat troops. The army had lost the majority of horses, artillery pieces, and supplies. Infantry units were fragmented, cavalry mobility was minimal, and artillery support was severely restricted. Engineers and supply officers continued to facilitate movement and maintain minimal logistical support, but operational flexibility had been severely constrained. Russian forces continued harassment operations, avoiding large-scale engagement while exploiting the army's vulnerability. Weather conditions worsened as November progressed. Snowstorms, freezing temperatures, and icy roads slowed movement, increased exposure-related casualties, and further strained supply distribution. Troops marching over long distances faced frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion. The reduced number of horses limited artillery transport and cavalry effectiveness, forcing commanders to prioritize the movement of essential equipment and personnel. The logistical collapse further magnified the army's vulnerability to Russian harassment. Reorganization and command decisions during this phase were critical. Napoleon coordinated movements of the remaining corps, adjusted columns to reduce congestion, and prioritized the protection of supply trains and rearguard units. Marshal-level commanders implemented tactical measures to stabilize columns under threat, maintain communication between dispersed units, and facilitate river crossings and road repairs. Staff officers ensured that orders were transmitted despite delays and fragmentation caused by the harsh environment and continuous attrition. The long retreat highlighted the effectiveness of the Russian strategy. By avoiding direct engagement, preserving combat strength, and conducting continuous harassment, Russian forces were able to impose heavy attrition on the Grande Armée without risking significant losses. Russian light cavalry operations disrupted supply, forced the abandonment of equipment, and contributed to the decline in French troop numbers. Combined with the extreme winter, the campaign demonstrated the importance of environmental conditions and strategic planning in determining operational outcomes. By the end of November 1812, the Grande Armée had lost the ability to conduct sustained offensive or defensive operations. Infantry units were reduced to small formations. Cavalry was largely ineffective, and artillery mobility was minimal. The army was a shadow of its original size and strength, with remaining troops facing exposure, hunger, and disease. Engineers continued to maintain minimal road and bridge infrastructure, while supply officers distributed what limited provisions remained. Russian forces continued to pressure the retreating army, preserving strategic initiative and operational advantage. The long retreat of November 1812 was characterized by extreme environmental conditions, systematic Russian harassment, and cumulative attrition. Troop numbers declined dramatically, operational capacity was severely limited, and logistical collapse threatened the survival of remaining forces. Commanders implemented measures to maintain order, protect supply trains, and preserve the remnants of the army, but the combination of cold, disease, starvation, and enemy pressure imposed a continuous and unrelenting operational challenge. By late November 1812, the remnants of Napoleon's Grande Armée had been reduced to fewer than 30,000 to 35,000 combat-effective troops, with many soldiers suffering from exhaustion, frostbite, disease, and starvation. The army had been retreating along the Smolensk road for over a month under constant harassment from Russian forces and the compounded effects of extreme weather and logistical collapse. The retreat now brought the army to the Berezina River, a major water obstacle near present-day Borisov, which posed a critical operational challenge. Crossing the river under enemy observation was essential for continued withdrawal toward Polish territory and ultimately the Niemen River. The Berezina River itself presented substantial natural difficulties. By late November, the water level had risen due to autumn rains and early winter melt. Ice began forming on sections of the river, creating unstable conditions for movement. The banks were marshy and forested in some areas, making access to suitable crossing points difficult for infantry, artillery, and supply trains. Bridges in the region had been destroyed or removed by Russian forces, leaving the French with the necessity of constructing temporary crossings under time pressure and potential attack. Engineers were tasked with the construction of pontoon bridges and improvised crossings using local timber, sleds, and available materials. Napoleon coordinated the crossing by organizing the army into multiple columns, assigning one for infantry, one for artillery, and one for supply and baggage trains. Cavalry units were positioned to guard flanks, conduct reconnaissance, and intercept Russian advance parties. Rear guard units were placed to delay Russian forces, covering the movement of the main army across the river. Staff officers oversaw communication, coordinated movement, and ensured synchronization of column crossings to prevent disorder and maximize efficiency under extreme conditions. Russian forces, aware of the French approach to the Berezina, deployed units to harass, delay, and disrupt the crossing. Cossack detachments and light cavalry operated aggressively against exposed French elements, attacking isolated units, foraging parties, and stragglers. Infantry units, supported by artillery where possible, occupied elevated positions overlooking potential crossing points to apply pressure on French engineers and disrupt bridge construction. Russian strategy focused on attrition, seeking to inflict maximum losses without committing to a decisive battle that could risk heavy casualties in winter conditions. The construction of temporary bridges across the Berezina required rapid and coordinated effort. French engineers, assisted by infantry units, cut timber, laid pontoons, and built platforms to facilitate the crossing of men, horses, and artillery. The bridges were designed for both foot soldiers and cavalry, though heavy artillery and supply wagons were restricted to limit structural collapse. Work proceeded under continuous harassment from Russian units, requiring the allocation of infantry and cavalry for defensive measures. The urgency of the construction reflected the operational necessity. Delay or failure would risk encirclement and annihilation of the retreating army. The French rearguard engaged in repeated skirmishes to protect the crossing operations. Infantry units positioned on riverbanks and along roads resisted Russian attacks, providing critical time for engineers to complete bridge construction. Cavalry units counterattacked or intercepted enemy detachments attempting to reach the bridge sites. Artillery, deployed where terrain permitted, delivered defensive fire to repel advancing Russian forces. The combined action of engineers, rear guard, infantry, and cavalry enabled the main body of the army to initiate crossings under extremely hazardous conditions. As French troops began crossing the Berezina on November 26th, environmental and operational difficulties compounded. Snow, ice, and mud hindered movement. Troops carried limited provisions, and many soldiers were weakened by previous attrition. Horses were exhausted and often collapsed during the crossing, forcing abandonment of equipment or artillery pieces. Communication between columns was challenged by distance, enemy interference, and environmental conditions, requiring staff officers and mounted couriers to coordinate movement and maintain order. Russian forces intensified attacks on the French during the crossing. Cossack units struck at isolated detachments attempting to access bridge points. Infantry engaged French units defending the banks, attempting to prevent the completion and utilization of the bridges. Artillery fire from elevated Russian positions targeted bridge sites and adjacent roads. French troops faced simultaneous operational threats from weather, terrain, and enemy action, requiring continuous adjustment of defensive and logistical measures. The crossing extended over several days, from 26 to November 29th. Engineers completed multiple bridge structures to accommodate the simultaneous movement of infantry, cavalry, and supply trains. The first columns of troops were able to cross under protection from rearguard units, followed by artillery batteries and wagon trains. The movement required strict organization to prevent congestion on bridges, collapse under excessive weight, or disorganization under enemy pressure. Troops crossing the river faced freezing temperatures, wet conditions, and exposure to enemy fire, leading to additional casualties. Casualty estimates during the Berezina crossing range from 20,000 to 30,000 French soldiers. Losses were caused by combat, exposure to cold, drowning in the river, collapse of ice and bridge structures, and abandonment of exhausted or wounded troops. Artillery and supply trains were partially destroyed to prevent capture by advancing Russian units. Horses were lost in large numbers, further reducing the army's mobility and capacity to transport remaining supplies. These losses marked a critical stage in the collapse of the Grande Armée as an operational force. Logistical management during the crossing remained essential to preserve what remained of the army. Supply officers coordinated the allocation of provisions and ammunition, engineers ensured the structural integrity of bridges, and commanders maintained defensive positions against Russian attacks. Cavalry units provided continuous protection, patrolled flanks, and engaged enemy detachments to prevent encirclement. Infantry units organized movement across the bridges, maintained order in the columns, and supported rear-guard defensive actions to allow subsequent troops to cross safely. The retreat across the Berezina demonstrated the integration of engineering, military coordination, and defensive operations under extreme conditions. French units successfully constructed temporary bridges, coordinated column movement, and maintained protection against superior Russian knowledge of the terrain and persistent harassment. However, the operational cost was extraordinarily high, with heavy casualties, loss of horses and artillery, and collapse of morale among exhausted and weakened soldiers. The crossing also highlighted the limitations imposed by environmental conditions. Freezing temperatures, snow, ice, and strong river currents contributed to the loss of life and equipment. Soldiers exposed to the elements suffered frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion, while horses frequently became incapacitated. The combination of natural obstacles and enemy pressure required continuous adjustment of plans, prioritization of movement, and allocation of resources to protect both personnel and critical equipment. Command decisions during the crossing were focused on maintaining order, protecting critical units, and ensuring completion of bridge construction. Napoleon supervised overall operations, directing corps commanders to allocate resources, position units strategically, and respond dynamically to emerging threats. Corps and division commanders executed orders, coordinating infantry, artillery, cavalry, and engineer operations in a synchronized effort to facilitate the crossing and prevent catastrophic losses. Staff officers played a crucial role in transmitting orders, monitoring progress, and adjusting allocations of troops and supplies in response to conditions on the ground. Russian forces continued to monitor French movements throughout the crossing. Cossacks and light cavalry conducted reconnaissance and targeted isolated or vulnerable units. Russian artillery and infantry positioned near bridge sites applied pressure on French operations. However, Russian commanders avoided committing to a full-scale assault in the face of prepared French defenses, preferring to inflict attritional losses and maintain pressure until the French army had fully crossed the river. This strategy preserved Russian operational strength while exploiting the weakened condition of the French forces. By November 29th, the majority of the surviving Grande Armée had crossed the Berezina River. The operation allowed Napoleon to preserve a fraction of his forces, preventing complete encirclement and destruction by Russian forces. While the crossing was a logistical and tactical success under extremely adverse conditions, the army had been irreversibly reduced in combat strength, morale, and operational capability. Remaining troops faced continued retreat, exposure to severe winter conditions, and harassment by Russian forces along the route to the Niemen River. The Berezina crossing marked the symbolic and operational collapse of the Grande Armée's effectiveness. Of the hundreds of thousands of troops that had invaded Russia in June 1812, only a fraction survived the retreat with functional combat capability. Artillery, cavalry, and logistical assets had been largely destroyed or abandoned. Commanders faced ongoing challenges in maintaining cohesion, allocating remaining resources, and planning subsequent movement through hostile territory. Russian forces, strategically positioned and operationally intact, retained the initiative and the ability to continue pressuring the retreating French army. The crossing highlighted the interplay of engineering, logistics, environmental factors, and enemy action in determining operational outcomes. French engineers demonstrated technical skill and coordination in constructing temporary bridges under fire and extreme conditions. Commanders executed complex movements to maintain order, protect supply trains, and defend against harassment. Infantry and cavalry units engaged in continuous action to facilitate movement while under extreme physical and environmental stress. Despite these efforts, losses were substantial, reflecting the cumulative effects of attrition, climate, and operational exhaustion. The Berezina operation concluded with the French army continuing its retreat westward toward Polish territory. Troop numbers had been reduced dramatically, with effective combat strength limited to a small fraction of the original invading force. Losses of equipment, artillery, and horses further diminished operational flexibility. Remaining supply trains were critically low, and troops faced exposure, disease, and limited medical support. Russian forces continued to apply strategic pressure, maintaining harassment operations and monitoring the retreating army's movements. By early December 1812, the remnants of Napoleon Bonaparte's Grande Armée had crossed the Berezina River and continued their westward retreat through the territory of present-day Belarus and Poland. The retreat toward the Niemen River became the immediate objective for the surviving forces. Crossing the Niemen would place the remnants of the Grande Armée back within territory under French influence or Allied control and remove them from immediate contact with pursuing Russian forces. Napoleon organized the retreat into columns, attempting to preserve the structure of corps and divisions despite extensive attrition. Infantry units marched in designated formations, while the few remaining artillery pieces were concentrated and moved with the assistance of available horses. Cavalry units, severely reduced in number and strength, screened flanks, conducted reconnaissance, and engaged in limited harassment of Russian units to protect the main body. Supply and logistical management remained critical during this final phase of retreat. The army's supply situation was dire. Rations were minimal, limited to hardtack, dried meat, and other preserved foods were available. Foraging was largely unsuccessful due to the prior devastation of villages and agricultural resources. Horses were further weakened or lost due to malnutrition and exhaustion, compromising both cavalry operations and the movement of remaining artillery. Commanders rationed remaining supplies and prioritized their allocation to combat units and essential personnel. Medical officers attempted to treat frostbite, injuries, and disease, but limited resources and the extreme winter environment restricted the effectiveness of care. Environmental conditions in early December exacerbated the army's deterioration. Temperatures remained below -20 degrees Celsius in many areas, with snow, ice, and strong winds creating treacherous marching conditions. Soldiers and horses were exposed to these conditions for extended periods, resulting in further cases of frostbite, hypothermia, and death. Roads were frozen and often blocked by snow, slowing movement and causing congestion in the retreating columns. Crossing rivers and streams required temporary bridging or the use of ice-covered areas, creating additional risk of casualties from falling into freezing water or collapsing ice. Russian forces continued to pursue the retreating French army with a strategy of harassment and pressure. Cossack units conducted continuous raids on isolated infantry detachments, supply trains, and stragglers, inflicting casualties and further disorganizing the already weakened formations. Russian infantry units occasionally engaged in skirmishes along roads or near river crossings to delay French movement and impose attritional losses. Reconnaissance by Russian cavalry provided continuous updates on the French columns' locations, enabling Russian commanders to focus harassment operations on the most vulnerable segments. Command and control within the Grande Armée was increasingly fragmented. Communications were hindered by the distance between columns, environmental obstacles, and the loss of experienced staff officers. Corps commanders maintained relative autonomy in directing their units, responding to immediate threats, and coordinating movement with adjacent formations. Staff officers transmitted orders where possible, but delays and breakdowns in communication were common. Despite these challenges, Napoleon and his marshals prioritized maintaining cohesion of the retreating army, attempting to prevent further fragmentation that could result in catastrophic losses. Rearguard operations remained a critical component of the retreat. Infantry and cavalry units were positioned to delay Russian pursuit, protect supply trains, and facilitate the movement of the main body. Artillery support, limited to a few movable pieces, provided defensive fire to hold key positions. Rearguard units often engaged in repeated skirmishes, conducted controlled withdrawals, and covered river crossings and road choke points. Coordination between rearguard units and the main army columns was essential to prevent encirclement and ensure continued retreat. By mid-December, the army approached the Niemen River, marking the boundary between Russian territory and the Duchy of Warsaw, which was under French control. Crossing the Niemen was essential to conclude the operational retreat from Russia and stabilize the remaining forces. Temporary bridges and fords were used to facilitate the movement of infantry, cavalry, and what remained of the artillery and supply trains. Engineers worked under harsh conditions to ensure the safe passage of troops, while rearguard units defended against sporadic Russian attacks and harassment. Casualties continued to accumulate during this final phase. Soldiers succumbed to exposure, malnutrition, and disease. Desertion and straggling increased as soldiers, exhausted and without adequate supplies, fell behind or abandoned the army entirely. Horses, already diminished in number, continued to die from starvation, overwork, and the extreme winter conditions. Artillery units abandoned what could not be moved, prioritizing mobility and the survival of remaining personnel. These losses further reduced the operational capacity of the army and underscored the catastrophic impact of the Russian campaign on Napoleon's forces. The crossing of the Niemen marked the effective end of the Grande Armée as an operational force. While thousands of soldiers survived to enter French-controlled territory, the army had lost the majority of its strength, cohesion, and combat capability. The remaining forces were insufficient for offensive operations and could only serve as garrison or reserve units. The catastrophic attrition experienced during the campaign demonstrated the combined effects of strategic miscalculation, environmental extremes, logistical failure, and sustained enemy harassment. Strategically, the retreat and completion of the campaign had immediate consequences for Napoleon and France. The destruction of the Grande Armée weakened France's military capacity in Europe, exposing French territory and allied states to potential operations by opposing coalitions. The loss of experienced officers and soldiers diminished the French army's effectiveness in subsequent campaigns. Morale, both within the military and among the French population, was severely affected by reports of the army's destruction and the failure of the Russian campaign. The retreat also demonstrated the operational resilience of Russian forces. The Russian army had successfully avoided decisive engagement in favor of a strategy focused on attrition and harassment. Scorched earth tactics, combined with disciplined rearguard operations and the exploitation of environmental conditions, inflicted catastrophic losses on the French forces without necessitating large-scale battles. Russian command maintained cohesion and operational initiative, positioning forces to capitalize on French weakness while minimizing their own losses. Throughout the early and mid-December phase, coordination between surviving French units remained essential for survival. Corps commanders organized marches, protected supply trains, and facilitated the crossing of rivers and roads. Cavalry units conducted reconnaissance, screening, and limited counterattacks to maintain operational integrity. Engineers and staff officers worked to ensure mobility and maintain lines of communication. Despite these efforts, the Army's diminished strength and depleted resources severely limited operational options and necessitated prioritization of survival over strategic or tactical gains. The human cost of the campaign became fully apparent during this phase. Of the original 600,000 troops that began the invasion of Russia in June 1812, approximately 400,000 to 450,000 were killed, captured, or permanently incapacitated by December. Losses included soldiers from France, allied states, and auxiliary units. The surviving troops were reduced to scattered formations, many of which required reorganization, reinforcement, and replenishment before they could participate effectively in further military operations. Horses, artillery, and equipment losses compounded the operational collapse, making reconstruction of the army a protracted and challenging process. Disease remained a continuous threat during early to mid-December. Dysentery, typhus, frostbite, and other cold-related illnesses caused additional casualties. Limited medical resources, harsh environmental conditions, and prolonged exposure meant that survival rates were low. Sick and wounded soldiers who were unable to march were abandoned, captured by Russian forces, or perished in the field. Medical units operated under extreme strain, attempting to treat large numbers of affected personnel with insufficient supplies and facilities. The retreat and end of the campaign also illustrated the limitations of Napoleon's strategic planning. Initial assumptions regarding supply availability, speed of advance, and capacity for sustained occupation of Moscow were proven inaccurate. The inability to compel Tsar Alexander I to negotiate, combined with the extended distances and environmental extremes, transformed what was intended as a decisive campaign into a catastrophic attritional event. Commanders faced continuous operational challenges that exceeded planning assumptions and required ad hoc adjustments to preserve what remained of the army. By mid-December 1812, surviving units of the Grande Armée had re-entered territory under French or Allied control. The army was functionally incapable of conducting offensive operations, and surviving troops required rest, reorganization, and resupply. The operational collapse of the campaign left Napoleon with a severely weakened military presence in Eastern Europe. The psychological, strategic, and political consequences of this retreat were significant, shaping subsequent European campaigns and influencing the formation of coalitions against France. The retreat of the Grande Armée in December 1812 concluded the operational phase of the Russian campaign. While isolated engagements and minor skirmishes continued during the withdrawal, the army's combat capability was effectively destroyed. Commanders focused on ensuring survival, facilitating movement, and protecting remaining personnel. The army that had invaded Russia 6 months earlier no longer existed as an organized fighting force, marking a definitive endpoint to the campaign. The conclusion of Napoleon Bonaparte's 1812 Russian campaign had profound and immediate consequences for France, the Grande Armée, and the European political and military landscape. Following the retreat from Moscow, the catastrophic losses of manpower, cavalry, artillery, and logistical resources transformed the French military position from dominance to vulnerability. Of the approximately 600,000 soldiers who initially entered Russian territory, estimates indicate that between 400,000 and 450,000 were killed, captured, missing, or permanently incapacitated. This reduction included French soldiers, Allied contingents from Italy, Poland, Germany, and other client states, as well as auxiliary units, leaving the Grande Armée drastically weakened and scattered. The operational collapse of the French army directly influenced strategic considerations across Europe. With the bulk of Napoleon's experienced troops lost, French defensive capacity in Central and Eastern Europe was reduced significantly. The absence of a functioning army in Eastern Europe created openings for opposing coalitions, particularly the Sixth Coalition, to reorganize and plan offensive operations against French-controlled territories. European powers that had previously been neutral or allied with France, observing the catastrophic retreat, recognized both the vulnerability of Napoleon's forces and the limitations of French power. This shift altered the balance of power and encouraged previously hesitant states to commit to anti-French coalitions. The loss of experienced commanders and officers during the campaign further compounded France's military challenges. Many senior officers had perished or been incapacitated, while others returned with weakened authority due to the demoralizing conditions and failures of the campaign. The attrition of trained leadership impaired the army's capacity to conduct complex operations in subsequent campaigns. Corps commanders, division commanders, and staff officers were replaced, often with less experienced personnel, reducing overall operational competence. The army required extensive reorganization, training, and resupply before it could resume offensive operations on the scale previously possible. The material consequences of the campaign were equally severe. The Grande Armée's artillery, supply trains, and transport vehicles were largely destroyed, abandoned, or captured. Horses, essential for cavalry mobility and artillery transport, had perished in vast numbers due to starvation, overwork, and cold. Ammunition, provisions, and medical supplies were depleted, leaving the surviving army incapable of sustaining long-term operations. Rebuilding the logistical network required substantial effort and resources, including the acquisition of horses, replacement of artillery, and restocking of rations and equipment. The cumulative material losses limited France's capacity to project power effectively in subsequent campaigns in 1813 and 1814. Russia's defensive strategy and the harsh environmental conditions were central to the outcome of the campaign. Russian forces, under the strategic leadership of Tsar Alexander I, General Mikhail Kutuzov, and subordinate commanders, avoided decisive engagement in favor of harassment, attrition, and the strategic use of scorched earth tactics. Villages, crops, and resources were destroyed as the French advanced, denying supplies to the invading army. The retreat from Moscow exposed the French army to extreme winter conditions, further amplified by inadequate preparations for the climate. Continuous harassment by Cossacks, light cavalry, and Russian infantry units ensured that French forces could not regroup or recover during the retreat, leading to significant casualties from combat, exposure, and starvation. The psychological impact on the surviving troops was profound. Soldiers who had endured the campaign returned physically and mentally exhausted, suffering from frostbite, disease, and trauma from combat losses. Desertion and surrender during the retreat indicated the extreme stress experienced by the army. The French military had experienced a dramatic reversal in fortune. An army that had been considered the strongest in Europe at the beginning of the campaign was rendered incapable of conducting coordinated operations by its conclusion. Survivors required reorganization, medical care, and time to recover before they could participate in future operations. Politically, the failure of the Russian campaign undermined Napoleon's prestige across Europe. Previously dominant French influence was questioned by Allied and neutral states. European powers that had previously tolerated or acquiesced to French expansion saw the vulnerability created by the Russian campaign as an opportunity to challenge French hegemony. The loss of the Grande Armée shifted perceptions of French military invincibility, encouraging states such as Prussia, Austria, and Britain to reconsider their alliances and begin preparations for coordinated action against France. The campaign directly contributed to the formation and mobilization of the Sixth Coalition in 1813. The campaign also demonstrated the limitations of centralized strategic planning under extreme environmental conditions. Napoleon's operational assumptions had relied on rapid movement, available local provisions, and the capacity to compel Tsar Alexander I to negotiate following the capture of Moscow. The reality of vast distances, harsh winter conditions, logistical collapse, and disciplined Russian strategy exposed the vulnerabilities of large-scale invasions in hostile territory. These lessons influenced future European military planning regarding supply lines, operational timing, and adaptation to environmental constraints. Surviving French forces were distributed across the Duchy of Warsaw, Poland, and Allied territories for reorganization and rest. Commanders established temporary garrisons, facilitated medical care for wounded and sick soldiers, and worked to reconstitute remaining units. The reorganization included integration of surviving soldiers into new formations, replacement of lost officers, and recruitment of additional troops from Allied states to rebuild operational capability. Despite these efforts, the Army's strength remained a fraction of its original size, and the loss of experience and material constrained the scope of future operations. The Russian campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of attritional strategy and strategic withdrawal in defending against a superior invading force. Russian forces achieved operational success without committing to large-scale decisive engagements, preserving their strength while imposing maximum losses on the enemy. Scorched earth tactics, combined with harassment operations and environmental conditions, created sustained pressure that led to catastrophic attrition among French forces. The campaign confirmed the strategic value of maintaining operational initiative while exploiting enemy vulnerabilities through indirect means rather than relying solely on battlefield engagement. The wider European context was immediately affected by the campaign's outcome. Prussia, previously constrained by treaties and alliances with France, began to align with anti-French coalitions. Austria and other states reassessed their diplomatic and military positions in light of the diminished French military capacity. Britain, as part of the ongoing continental conflict, viewed the campaign as evidence of the weakening French position and continued to provide financial and logistical support to continental opponents. The Russian victory and French losses altered the strategic balance, creating conditions favorable for coalition operations in 1813. The campaign also had significant implications for Napoleon's personal authority and strategic decision-making. The scale of the losses, combined with failure to secure a decisive political or military outcome in Russia, undermined his image as a strategist capable of achieving decisive victories in all circumstances. Political pressure increased in Paris and within Allied states as reports of the army's destruction circulated. Napoleon faced the dual challenge of restoring military capability and managing the political ramifications of the campaign, including the potential for unrest among occupied territories and allied nations. Logistically, the French military faced the challenge of rebuilding the army in preparation for future campaigns. Reconstitution required recruitment, training, and integration of replacement troops, acquisition of horses and artillery, and re-establishment of supply lines. Engineering units were tasked with repairing roads, bridges, and fortifications to facilitate movement and defense. The strain on French resources was compounded by ongoing obligations in other theaters of operation, creating a prolonged period of recovery before France could regain operational capacity equivalent to pre-1812 levels. The Russian campaign influenced the conduct of subsequent military operations in Europe. Commanders across the continent observed the vulnerabilities exposed by the Russian winter, the consequences of overextended supply lines, and the risks of operating in hostile territory without secured local support. The campaign provided detailed operational data on attrition rates, logistical constraints, and environmental impacts on troop movement, informing the planning and execution of military campaigns in 1813 and 1814. The lessons learned had enduring relevance for European military doctrine. The social and demographic impact on France and Allied states was also significant. The scale of human loss created gaps in the military-age male population, affecting labor availability, economic productivity, and social structures. Families of soldiers faced hardship due to the absence or death of members, and the loss of experienced officers and non-commissioned personnel disrupted military and civil administration in occupied territories. Rebuilding both military and civilian institutions required time, resources, and coordinated policy measures. In summary, the aftermath of Napoleon's Russian campaign encompassed military, political, strategic, and social dimensions. The destruction of the Grande Armée weakened French military capacity, exposed vulnerabilities in strategic planning, and altered European perceptions of French power. Russian forces achieved operational success through attrition, harassment, and environmental exploitation, preserving their strength while inflicting catastrophic losses. The campaign set the stage for the formation of the Sixth Coalition, shifts in alliances, and subsequent military campaigns aimed at challenging French dominance in Europe. The consequences of the campaign extended beyond immediate military outcomes, influencing political strategy, logistical planning, and the conduct of warfare in Europe. The loss of troops, equipment, and leadership required extensive reorganization and reconstruction, while the diminished operational capacity constrained France's ability to respond to coalition threats. Russian resilience and the effective use of environment and attrition as strategic tools demonstrated the critical importance of adaptive strategy in large-scale warfare. The Russian campaign also underscored the limits of Napoleon's previous operational assumptions. Expectations of rapid advance, availability of supplies, and the capacity to compel the Tsar to negotiate were negated by the realities of terrain, climate, and enemy strategy. The retreat highlighted the vulnerability of overextended armies operating in hostile territory without secure lines of supply or sufficient contingency planning. Future European campaigns would be shaped by these lessons, influencing both French and coalition military planning, resource allocation, and operational doctrine. By the end of the Russian campaign, the Grande Armée had ceased to exist as a coherent military force. While surviving elements were reconstituted over the following months, the army's experience, cohesion, and combat capacity had been irreparably damaged. The scale of loss, operational failure, and strategic consequences ensured that the 1812 campaign remained a defining turning point in the Napoleonic Wars, fundamentally altering the military, political, and strategic landscape of Europe.